Beginning of Story 1. The gulls circled low over the grey water that morning, their wings catching what little light managed to press through the clouds. The harbour in Greyford was still. The ropes along the pier sagged heavy with damp, and the smell of salt was muted, as if the tide itself was holding its breath. That was when Samuel Cutter found the journal. It lay in a shallow pool at the edge of the dock, a small black leather-bound book, edges worn smooth as if it had been turning in someone's pocket for years. Its cover was cold to the touch, the way stones are cold after a night of rain. He almost didn't pick it up. People in Greyford didn't touch things that washed up. There were stories. But the weather hadn't changed in weeks, and the air was thick with a kind of restless waiting, so he slipped it into his coat. Later, over the slow ticking of his kitchen clock, Samuel opened the journal. The first page was blank except for a single line. He walks when the sea is still. There was no name, no date. Turning the page, the writing grew cramped, hurried, as though the hand behind it feared the ink would run out before the thought could finish. It spoke of nights where a tall man was seen standing at the edge of the pier, leaning on a walking stick, watching the horizon long after the last boat had come in. And always, the sightings came before storms that seemed to last forever. Samuel closed the book. His tea had gone cold. Outside, the tide had not moved since morning. The next entry was dated 53 years ago. The date was written in faded blue ink. March 14th, 1972, though the edges of the page had softened to a pale yellow, curling inward as if trying to keep the words hidden. The handwriting shifted from hurried to precise, every letter balanced and deliberate, as though the writer had taken time to steady their hand before each line. The weather hasn't changed in weeks. The tide waits, the gulls keep low, he has been seen again. Long put. Samuel brushed his thumb over the words, half expecting the ink to smear, but it stayed fixed, as if time itself had dried it into the paper. He kept reading. The entry described the man in detail. Tall, too thin for the heavy coat he wore, the brim of his hat casting his face in shadow even on the brightest days. The walking stick wasn't for support, the writer insisted, but for measuring. Measuring something. Each night he appeared, he would walk the length of the pier, stop at the farthest post, and tap the stick against the wood 3 times before leaving. No one ever saw him approach or depart. He was simply there, and then he wasn't. Samuel shifted in his chair. The room had grown colder without him noticing. He set the journal down, the sound of it against the table louder than it should have been. Outside, the fog had thickened until the water and sky were the same dull shade. He thought, briefly, that he saw a figure out by the pier. But when he leaned closer to the window, it was gone. That night, the sound came. 3 sharp knocks, evenly spaced, from the direction of the shore. Samuel stayed in bed listening. The knocks repeated every few minutes, steady as a heartbeat. He pulled the blanket higher, telling himself it was just the wind catching the boards, the same way it had 100 times before. But the wind had been still all day. The next morning, the journal had moved. He'd left it closed on the table, but now it lay open to another page. This one had no date. If you hear him knock, do not answer, do not look. He is not asking permission. He is measuring the threshold. Samuel closed the book and for the first time noticed something on the back cover. Pressed into the leather, nearly invisible unless the light caught it, was a single word: Greyford. By the 3rd day, the fog had settled over the town, so thick the church bell could barely be heard from 2 streets away. The harbour was silent. Boats sat unmoving, their ropes slack, their hulls rocking only slightly with the tide that refused to rise or fall. At noon, Samuel walked the pier. The wood was slick and the air so damp it clung to his coat. He counted each post, running his fingers over the grooves and knots, until he reached the farthest one. 3 small indentations marked the edge, fresh, sharp-edged, the size and spacing of a walking stick's ferrule. He looked down into the still water. No reflection met his eyes, only a dark, endless shape that seemed to breathe in the depths. And then a ripple. Samuel stepped back, heart quickening despite the heavy stillness around him. The journal felt heavier in his pocket, as though the sea itself were pulling at it. The next entry came to him without turning a page. In the middle of the night, he woke to find the journal open on his chest. The writing was still wet, the ink bleeding faintly into the fibres of the paper. He has measured the pier. He will measure the streets. He will measure your door. Samuel thought about burning it. But something deep in him, something older than reason, told him that destroying it wouldn't end the thing that had written in it. He closed the cover gently, as if afraid of waking something. Outside, beyond the fogged glass of his window, a shadow moved along the shoreline, slow, deliberate, tapping the ground with every third step. By morning, Samuel felt as though he hadn't slept at all. His kettle clicked and groaned, the sound oddly far away, as if it were coming through a wall he couldn't see. He watched the slow drift of steam and realized the window pane wasn't fogging from the inside anymore. It was the weather sitting against the glass like another sheet of breath. He buttoned his coat and slipped the small black leather-bound journal into the inner pocket, where it settled with a familiar weight. Outside, the narrow lanes of Greyford were emptied of their usual sounds. No hammer from the shipwright's shed, no cartwheels on stone, only the occasional drip from eaves to cobbles, as steady and careful as someone counting. Samuel kept to the side of the road, near the salt-stained fences and the low hedges, until he reached the post office. The door's bell made a tired jingle. Inside, Mrs. Bell looked up from her desk and pursed her lips. "You're out early," she said, as if the hour had offended her. Samuel nodded. "I have a question about—" He stopped, a little embarrassed by the shape of the worry in his mouth. About old reports, disappearances. Mrs. Bell blinked slowly, her gaze sliding past him to the wet window. Long pause. "You don't ask a thing like that on a week like this," she said, softer than her first tone. "Not when the tide hasn't moved." "The weather hasn't changed in weeks," Samuel murmured, as if quoting someone who wasn't in the room. Her eyes flicked to him, then to his coat pocket, as if she could see the corner of the journal through the fabric. "There's a box in the back," she said finally. "Old clippings, the sort they didn't want out in the binder, if you're quick." The box smelled of ink and damp cardboard. Samuel lifted a bundle tied with string, and then another, until he found a thin file with pier printed across the top in a neat, ancient hand. The paper inside had browned to the colour of weak tea. He skimmed headlines. Greyford fisherman lost at sea. Boat found adrift, nets unused. Missing. Night watchman. Footprints end at post 12. Strange taps reported on doors near harbour. In a smaller article, nearly swallowed by wedding announcements and adverts for raincoats, he found a name. Arthur Talley. The piece noted that Talley had last been seen near midnight, walking toward the pier with his lantern. There was mention of uniform marks along the planks, a pattern dismissed as a prank by the constable at the time. Samuel's fingers tightened. He counted back through the notes, the first mark at the first post, then the second, third, and so on, as if measuring off the town inch by inch. He placed the file back and thanked Mrs. Bell. She watched him leave with a look that hovered between worry and a kind of resigned recognition, like a person hearing an old song they never wanted to remember. He didn't return home right away. Instead, he walked the perimeter of the harbour, tracing the places where laneways met water, where fences turned, where doors faced the sea. He noticed things that might have always been there, and things that could not have been. A small chip at the base of a lamppost, 3 shallow divots in the stone at the mouth of an alley, a faint scuffing in the paint of a door frame at knee-height. He paused at the old bait shop, now shuttered, its sign clacking gently in the breathless air. On the door, just above the latch, someone had driven 3 tiny nails into the wood, their heads flush, their spacing exact. He reached for the journal. He hadn't opened it since the night the words had appeared on his chest. He wasn't sure he wanted to. But his fingers were already finding the ribbon marker, already parting the damp, soft pages. A new line waited in the careful, precise hand. When the measure is complete, the town learns its true size. Beneath it, in smaller script, a different pressure, a different age, do not be the last post. Samuel closed the book on his thumb, keeping his place, and breathed. The harbour smelled faintly of iron. He thought of Arthur Talley, and of the watchman's footprints that ended in nothing, and of the rhythm of those knocks against the midnight boards. He slid the journal away. That evening he sat by his small stove and listened to the tea water settle. He didn't light the lamp. The grey was thick enough to pass for a kind of twilight. In the dim, the familiar shapes of his kitchen softened. The coat on its peg, the cup on its saucer, the old wall clock with its slow, patient beat. When the knocks came, he counted them without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. They were not at his door. Not yet. They came from somewhere nearby. Next street over, perhaps, or the little lane that ran behind the fishmonger's. He didn't move. He kept breathing, in and out, until the sound returned. 1, 2, 3. He whispered the words he had read. Do not answer. Do not look. After a while, the rhythm walked away, the way footsteps would if the ground itself remembered where to carry them. Samuel slept in short folds, dreamless, folded again. When he woke, the air felt the same, a soft weight on the skin, a hush in the lungs. He rose and went to the door, not to open it, but to see. On the outside wood, at knee height, 3 faint lines had appeared in the night, no deeper than a fingernail. The spacing was exact. The measure had reached him. He boiled water and watched the surface barely stir. The weather hasn't changed in weeks, he said to the empty room, though it had only been days since he first found the journal. Time, he realized, was moving in a shape he didn't recognize. He took the long road to the church, because it wound uphill and away from the water. The path was slick under the hedgerows, the thorns tipped with beads of moisture that never quite fell. Inside, the nave was unlit. Candles waited in their trays, unspent. Father Hal stood near the front pew as if he'd been expecting him, his hands folded, his face pale with the kind of delicate tiredness that comes from keeping watch. You look like you've been listening, the priest said quietly. Samuel nodded. There are marks. There have always been marks. Father Hal replied. We only see them some years. He gestured to the side chapel, where a small glass case stood beside a table of hymnals. Inside, on a faded velvet square, lay a slender stick of dark wood tipped with a metal ferrule. It was old, polished smooth by time and hands, the metal dulled to a soft pewter colour. Samuel felt his mouth go dry. Is that? A walking stick, Father Hal said. Found after the storm of 72. That long stall in the tide? Your mother would remember. People said a man left it leaning against the far post and never came back to claim it. He traced the air near the case as if he could feel the weight of the object through the glass. Some also said no one ever saw him at all, only his measuring after he had gone. Samuel stood very still. The stick was not remarkable, not in the way an object is when it belongs to a person of note. It was the opposite, ordinary to the point of disappearing, the kind of thing that could be part of a man's outline without drawing a single thought. And yet here, in the church light, its presence was undeniable. Father Hal watched him. You found something. A journal, Samuel said. He kept his voice small. From the water. The priest's gaze flicked to the coat pocket again. How did everyone know? We have books like that too. He nodded toward the sacristy. Not holy ones, old ones. Accounts, letters, warnings. People wrote things down when the air stayed still and the clocks ran a little slow. He stepped closer, his shoes whispering on the stone. You should be careful with words that arrive on their own. They tend to keep the promise of where they came from. Samuel felt the shape of the journal against his ribs, like the edge of a coin. What should I do? Keep your door shut, Father Hal said gently. And when you hear the knocks, count, and pray you don't hear 4. The fourth knock did not come that night, but the measure moved. He felt it in the way people in town spoke without lifting their eyes, in the way the grocer set down change with his palm instead of his fingers, in the way the school bell did not bother to ring even though children still came and went, their steps small and quick. At dusk, Samuel walked to the harbour, drawn by a quiet he could not ignore. Along the pier near the posts, paper ribbons had been tied, old sailors' charms, twisted from tide schedules and torn notices fluttering in the breathless air as if wind remembered them. On some, in pencil, were the words, "Not this door, not this one, pass by," the handwriting of people who knew exactly how to ask and precisely how little could be asked for. Near the end of the pier, at the farthest post, the wood bore 3 fresh, clean taps in a line. Samuel stood with his hands in his pockets and stared into the water. The surface was flat, but it wasn't calm. It had the look of something thinking. He heard footsteps behind him, slow, measured, each one settling perfectly before the next. He didn't turn. He didn't breathe. He saw the reflection of a long coat drape over his shoulder and the suggestion of a hat brim touching the edge of his sight, where horizon becomes a notion. "Evening," Samuel said, because the ordinary word was a rope tossed into the fog. The figure stepped to his side without sound, the way an old thought arrives. For a long moment they stood like that, facing the same stillness. The ferrule of a walking stick touched the wood, not tapping, just resting like a pen waiting at the edge of a sentence. "You've been measuring," Samuel whispered. No answer came, but the stick lifted and set down once, then once more, and then a third time, light as rain. He did not look at the man's face. He would not. Instead, he studied the post ahead, the next post, the world narrowing into marks and distances. He had the sudden certainty that if he turned his head the smallest degree, he would see nothing at all, and that the nothing would be worse than any face. "Is it soon?" he asked. "Whatever it is you're measuring toward." The stick paused. The ferrule pressed so lightly to the wood that it left no mark at all, a zero, a circle, an absence that nevertheless counted. Then the weight lifted. The reflection beside him thinned, as if the coat were taking long steps away into a place the pier did not reach. Samuel remained until the grey thinned to something lighter and then darkened again, losing track. He walked home by the narrow lanes with the ribbons tied, with the tiny nail heads indoors catching what little light lived in the fog. He woke because the journal was open. It lay on the chair beside the bed, fat with damp, its spine making a small shadow. The page showed 2 hands of writing. The first, the neat one, said of tides and clocks and patient counting. The second, the hurried one, had been thrown on top. He came to the threshold. I did not answer. I did not look. He measured the lintel and the hinge and the stone at my feet. He left a mark I could not see until morning. Samuel lifted the book so gently the paper barely moved. Beneath the last line, no signature waited, only the faint ghost of another sentence that didn't quite come through. He tilted the page to the window, seeking the watermark of words. When the light found it, he read, "We are." And then the fibres went blank. He closed the journal and laid it across his knees. For a long time, he listened to the house make the small sounds that meant it remembered being built, a quiet stretch in the beams, a soft settling in the floorboards, the politeness of old wood not wishing to disturb. At dawn, if dawn could be said to pass through this unchanging weather, he found it. The mark. On the stone at his threshold, at the place where boots always scraped the last shore mud, 3 lines had been drawn so faintly he wouldn't have seen them if the day hadn't leaned just right. Between the second and third line lay a narrow space, not quite as wide as the others. The imperfection hummed in his skin the way a near-solved sum hums in the mind. He went to the cupboard and took down the old brush, the one he used to clean salt from hinges, and he scrubbed at the lines until his wrist ached. When he stepped back, the stone looked the same. The lines did not fade. He laid the brush aside and, against everything the journal had advised, he opened his door and looked out onto the lane. Nothing waited there. only the quiet and the hedges and the ribbons where people had asked in pencil to be passed by. There are records in Greyford of storms that did not storm, of winds that stayed on the far side of a hill and forgot to cross over, of ships that moored with all their lines neat and their lanterns bright, and no one aboard to claim the work. Names are still spoken in kitchens where the kettle ticks, the Gulliver found circling an eddy without a hand at her tiller, the night ferry that slid into the wrong mouth of the river and did not trouble to find the right one again. A trio of keepers on the outer rock who left their plates stacked as if they were washing up directly and were simply delayed. In every telling, the weather is the same, not violent, not dramatic, just a long-breathed sameness, a pause that is not resting. Samuel thought of those names as he walked to the far edge of town where the cottages find the last fence and the land becomes common field. He had the sense, a fragile thread of it, that if he could stand somewhere that was not yet measured, he might learn what the measure meant. At the final gate, he felt the journal press against his ribs like a suggestion. He took it out and let it fall open. The page was blank, wet bright. For a moment, nothing came. Then the neat hand formed a single sentence, so small he had to bend close. Stand where the map does not reach. He blinked. The book had never mentioned a map. But now, beneath the line, the page paled, and the faint outline of a coastline bled into view, not drawn in ink but revealed as though it had always been part of the paper. It was Greyford, the harbour's curve, the lanes, the posts. A tiny pencil cross marked his threshold, another cross near the bait shop, another at the pier's end. The marks formed a pattern that might have meant nothing, except that a thin, unmarked margin ran along the fields where he stood, a pale band with no tally of lines. Samuel closed the journal carefully and stepped beyond the gate. The air there had a different feel, though he could not have said how. Perhaps it tasted less of metal, perhaps it simply did not seem to be counting. He stood in that unmeasured margin until the day dimmed further, until the hedges were only shapes and the town lay behind him like a folded piece of paper. He thought of the walking stick's ferrule, of the way it had touched down without marking, then of the circle that meant zero, but also meant whole. When he finally walked back, it was full dark. The lane showed no lamplight. At his door, he set his hand to the wood and waited. The knocks did not come. Inside, he left the lamp unlit and sat beside the window, the journal under his palm, feeling its small pulse, not of life but of intention. He slept without meaning to. In his sleep, he heard the distant sound of tapping, not at his house, not at any house, but out on the water, on wood that floated, counting new distances. He woke with the taste of salt on his tongue. In the morning, someone had chalked a line down the centre of the main street. Not a child's play, not a prank. A precise plumb line rendered with a mason's patience, running from the statue by the square to the old wall at the far end, perfectly straight even where the cobbles lifted and dipped. On one side, ribbons on doors fluttered. On the other, doors were bare. People stepped carefully, as if crossing the line meant knowing something they weren't ready to know. Samuel stood near the corner bakery, reading the faces without staring. The baker's wife wiping her hands on her apron in a rhythm she did not recognize as a rhythm. The fisherman with the scar on his knuckle counting the seconds between the bell's non-rings. Mrs. Bell, still as glass in her window. He turned and found Father Hal at his elbow. "It's nearer," the priest said. Samuel nodded. "There's a place beyond the fields the map doesn't know." The priest's gaze sharpened. "And did it help?" "I don't know," Samuel said truthfully, but it felt not measured. Father Hal made a low sound, not quite agreement, not quite doubt. "Sometimes," he said, "when people disappear, it is because they stepped into the part of the world that no one had bothered to mark yet. The old men at the harbour say that's mercy. The women at the market say that's neglect." He looked at Samuel with something like apology. "And I say, keep your door shut." That night the knocks came again. 1, 2, 3. They were softer this time, as if the wood and the knocker had grown accustomed to each other. Samuel sat in his chair and counted with them, his breath moving in and out of the count, his hands quiet on the arms. When they ceased, he waited for the room to begin moving again, for the clock to resume its rightful patience, for the kettle to remember its small, kind sounds. Instead, the journal opened itself on his lap. The neat hand wrote, "When the counting ends, the shape remains." And then, in the hurried script, darker, crowding the margin, I went where the lines were not. I did not vanish. I went. Samuel closed his eyes. In the darkness behind them, he saw the line of chalk in the street, the pencil crosses on the page, the space between the second and third mark at his threshold, not quite as wide. He thought of the ferrule pressing without marking, the circle of weight that meant nothing and everything. He stood. He took his coat. He did not take a lantern. He left the journal on the table and stepped into the lane, into the steadiness of the unchanged weather. He followed the chalk until it ended at the old wall, and from there he walked by memory, through hedges and low fences, to the gate where the fields begin. He crossed into the narrow band where the paper had gone pale under his fingers. Behind him in Greyford, a walking stick touched down lightly at a door that was closed, at a door that did not answer, at a door that had been counted already. Ahead of him, the unmeasured land received him without question, the grass slick with a dew that did not bead, only was. He paused and listened. No knocks, no counting. The weather hadn't changed in weeks, and here it didn't need to. Samuel took another step into the margin and let the town for a while be a map someone else would have to read. Story 2. The first time I heard the name Greyford, it came from a police file. One I wasn't supposed to be reading. It was in the bottom drawer of an archive cabinet at the county records office, tucked between property disputes from the 1940s and a set of missing persons reports so old the paper felt like onion skin. The file's label was faint, just the word rail in pencil, and inside was a thin stack of typed reports, each one bearing the same strange footnote in block capitals. No official record exists of Greyford Station. Long pause. That was how it began. A tangle of police reports about a train that officially had never existed. The first incident was dated November 3rd, 1981. A man named Charles Morley, age 47, had vanished after leaving work late one night. Witnesses, 2 colleagues and a night watchman, said they last saw him heading toward the main rail terminal in the city. The weather was described in each statement the same way. The air was heavy. It felt like before a storm, but no wind. One of his colleagues claimed Morley had mentioned a direct line to Greyford, and that he'd laughed about it being quicker than the bus. But the city had no direct rail line to anywhere by that name. When police checked the station's departure logs, they found no record of any train departing at the time Morley would have been there. What made the file stranger was the next report, August 12th, 1994. Another disappearance, another witness swearing they saw a friend board a late-night train from the city. Same description, old carriages, dark paint, soft yellow light inside. Same footnote, no official record exists of Greyford Station. I kept reading. There were 6 incidents in all, spanning 3 decades. Always late at night, always in still, humid weather, always with the same kind of train, the kind that looked like it belonged in a museum. Each statement included one unnerving detail. Once the person boarded, no one else seemed to notice the train at all. It was as if the witnesses were watching something that existed only for them. The final report was different. Dated February 2nd, 2007, it was only half a page, typed hastily and signed with initials instead of a full name. The report didn't describe a disappearance, it described a return. The subject, a woman named Annette Price, had been reported missing in 1985, last seen boarding an old dark train at the main terminal. 22 years later, she walked into a roadside cafe at 3 a.m, 20 miles from the nearest town. She was wearing the same clothes she'd been reported missing in. The cuffs were damp with what she claimed was condensation from the train windows. She told the responding officer she had gotten off at the wrong stop. When asked where she'd been all that time, she answered only, "The weather hasn't changed in weeks," and then she refused to speak again. The file ended there. I closed the folder and sat in the dim back room of the records office for a long time. I couldn't say why it unsettled me so much. I didn't know Charles Morley or Annette Price, and I'd never heard of Greyford beyond the name in the police file. But I couldn't shake the idea of that old dark train, the smell of damp in the air, the stillness before a storm, the yellow lights glowing against the windows. I knew even then that I'd go looking for it. I went back the next night. Not to the records office, to the main terminal where the reports said the train was last seen. I told myself I was only there to look, to stand where the stories touched the floor, and match them to something I could put a finger on. The station after midnight is a place that remembers how to be empty. The cafe lights go to sleep first, then the ticket windows, then the vending machines that talk to themselves only when no one's listening. The great boards that list departures and arrivals soften their brightness until the white letters look like breath on a mirror. Some places have echoes when they empty. This place had a hush, the kind that feels like a folded blanket. I walked the concourse with my hands in my coat pockets, following the faint polish where many feet had worn a path. A cleaner pushing a cart nodded once and didn't look up again. A guard by the far doors watched the glass instead of me. I had a stupid thought, that if I stopped moving, the whole station would forget I was there. I took the side stairs down to platform 7. Not because the file named it, the reports never did, but because platform 7's clock had been broken for as long as I could remember. The minute hand hovered at the mark between 12 and 1, as if choosing. I sat on a bench and listened for the sound of a train that didn't exist. The boards above the track showed nothing. The rails themselves were dark, the oil along their edges catching what light it could and holding it still. Far down the line, a red signal glowed. I watched it for a long time. It did not change. At some point, my eyes drifted. I don't know how long, and when I looked back, the red had softened to amber. I stood up, feeling suddenly off balance, like stepping onto a boat that wasn't rocking. The air had grown heavier, more present, as if the station had taken a slow breath and was holding it. A sound came then, not the groan of a modern carriage or the clean whir of an electric train, but a soft old hum, like a generator behind a wall, like the murmur of a kettle that's thinking about boiling. Light pressed against the far mouth of the tunnel, a low yellow light, warmer than I was used to seeing in a place like this. It moved the way fog moves when there's something inside it. The train slid into view like it had always been there. Dark painted carriages with narrow doors, the numbers stenciled in small, polite figures near the handles. The glass showed a wash of yellow behind thin curtains. There was a logo on the side I didn't recognize. Not a company exactly, more like a crest someone had drawn from memory. No one around me reacted. The cleaner kept pushing the cart. The guard by the doors watched the glass. The clock put its hand nowhere. I listened to the hum settle along the platform, and I heard, clear and precise, 3 gentle knocks. From inside the carriage, evenly spaced. The doors opened with a sigh that wasn't mechanical. It sounded too much like relief. I took one step toward the nearest compartment and felt something shift under my shoe. I looked down. A thin strip of paper lay there, as if threaded under the sole at just the right angle to catch. I lifted my foot and picked it up. It was a torn portion of a ticket. The ink had bled at the edges from damp, but the printed destination was still legible. Greyford. I held the paper in my palm and felt its softness. It had the give of something that had been carried in a pocket for years. On the back, a pencil had scraped a rough rectangle, a fragment of a map, maybe, drawn quick and earnest, the way a person adds detail to settle a memory. A small cross marked the corner of a pier. Beside it, in a cramped hand, someone had written, "Not this door." I should have left. I should have folded the paper back into the air and walked upstairs and stood under the bright board's cool lights until my skin remembered time. But I didn't. I stepped to the open door. Inside, the compartment smelled of fabric and old varnish, and a winter that didn't quite arrive. The lamps had shades that cast their light down in small circles, like islands of evening. A rack above the seats held a coat that wasn't a coat. It was a shape where a coat would belong. The glass of the window held a thin veil of condensation, though no breath touched it. On the seat nearest the door rested a small black leather-bound journal. I froze. The cover was worn the way use polishes a thing until it reflects a life back at itself. A faint press in the leather showed a word nearly erased by time. Greyford. I looked over my shoulder at the platform. No one was watching. I stepped in and sat, the journal between my hands. The train moved without moving, not a lurch, not a push, more a decision the world had made that we were elsewhere now. The station slipped away in a slow blur, and we were inside a tunnel where the walls weren't walls at all, only a colour darker than the carriage could be. I opened the journal. The first page was blank. The second held a sentence that looked freshly dried. He stands where the platform narrows. I turned a page. Another line waited, in a different hand. Do not answer any door that opens onto water. I went still, the way an animal does when it hears a branch move where there should be wind. I turned another page. The hand that had written there was careful, old-fashioned, each letter a decision. The weather hasn't changed in weeks. A soft rattle moved along the corridor. It wasn't the clatter of a modern bogey, not the neat percussion of rails. It was a tap, a pause. 2 taps, a pause. Then 3 gentle knocks sounded on the carriage door opposite mine. I didn't move. There was no one else in the compartment. The door's glass turned the corridor into a film of yellow shapes. The knocks came again, not demanding, only measuring. I counted without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. The handle trembled, not to turn, only to say hello to itself. The third time it stilled, the lamp over my seat pulsed once and returned to its steady low. From the corner of my eye, I saw a figure pause at the window across the corridor. A coat that gathered at the knees, a hat brim that knew shadows, the tip of a walking stick resting lightly against the floor. He did not look in. He was a suggestion that knew where to stop. I lowered my eyes to the journal so I wouldn't meet his. A map had begun to form across 2 pages, not printed. Revealed the way damp brings out old marks in paper, the curve of a harbour, the narrow streets, the pier with posts drawn as small black squares, a pencil cross at the farthest post. At the top corner, as if added by a practical hand, a small diagram showed a timetable box with no times printed, only the legend. Greyford Station, low tide only. The train slowed. I looked up. A platform slid into view through the condensation. Not the bright tiles of a modern station, but boards that had darkened with many winters. The lamps were low and yellow, the signs painted with letters you'd have to love to keep repainting. On the nearest post, in small, neat script, a hand had written, "Not this door." The door beside it had no writing at all. I thought of Annette Price stepping into a roadside cafe in the same damp cuffs she'd worn in 1985. I thought of Charles Morley making a joke about a direct line. I thought of the guard who'd watched the glass instead of me. I kept the journal open on my lap like a passenger with a newspaper and tried to see with the corner of my sight. A tall man with a walking stick stood at the far end of the platform, where the boards narrowed and turned into something like a jetty. He leaned, not for balance but for perspective, tapping the ferrule lightly once, then letting it hang a fraction above the wood. He was not old. He was also not young. He was a mark that went with the measure. He didn't beckon. He didn't turn. He simply was there, the way a clock is there even when you won't look at it. The door with no writing eased open a 1/4 inch. A cold, wet smell crept in. Not rot, not river, but the stillness of water that keeps its own count. I shut my eyes and breathed in through my nose, out through my mouth, the way one does in a waiting room when there's nothing to do but wait. Somewhere far away, a set of boards changed from amber to green without making a sound. "Not this door," I whispered gently, as if I were telling a child which cup was theirs. The door gave a quiet, conceding click and settled shut. Footsteps passed. They had the softness of felt and the certainty of plum. The walking stick tapped once more, then silence absorbed it the way dark absorbs colour. The train moved again, choosing to go. The platform slid backwards slow enough that the signs could decide if they'd been read. The lamps along its edge bowed slightly, then straightened, as if relieved to have performed correctly. We entered a long stretch of not quite tunnel and not quite night. The lamps in the carriage softened until I could hear them. I thought of the ticket sliver in my pocket. I lifted it to the journal's map. The torn corner matched a piece of coastline almost perfectly, a bite taken out of the page by someone with good teeth. On the reverse, the pencil rectangle, the little map within the map, aligned with a section of the pier. A tiny cross at its far end, and beside it, barely visible unless the light leaned right. "He walks when the sea is still." I turned another page. The handwriting changed again, a tidy municipal hand like an officer's notes. Case file cross-reference, A. Tally, watchman, S. Cutter, fisherman, Price, returnee. Pattern stable in still weather intervals. Advise eyes down, doors latched, count to 3, never 4. I said the names softly, for the way saying a name keeps the person from being only a name. Tut-Hutter, Price. The train sighed, the lamps breathed, and somewhere ahead a door opened onto water and someone stepped back in time. We slowed again. The condensation on the glass lifted like a curtain that had been trained to rise at cues. A different platform waited. This one narrower, its roof lower, the paint along the beams damp to the point of shine. It might have been a maintenance stop, a side platform used when a schedule hiccups. No sign announced it. Only a small brass plate near the stairs, dulled by many hands, with letters that were almost memory. Greyford. My breath caught. It sounded loud in the soft. The door in front of me nicked itself open a fraction, as if to say it was ready if I was. The air smelled of salt and faint electricity. A figure stood under the nearest lamp. Not the tall man with the stick now, but a woman in a neat coat, her hands folded around a small pocket watch. Her hair was pinned the way hair used to be pinned when time had a different weight. She looked at me without staring, the way one looks at someone who has found the same path by accident. "Has the weather changed?" I asked, hearing how quiet the question was even as I spoke it. Her mouth moved, not smiling. "It hasn't changed in weeks," she said, with a softness that made the word weeks mean something other than days added up. She held the watch a little higher. "It doesn't run here," she added, not apologizing. The train gave a courteous cough, a reminder that it had places to be that were not places. The woman inclined her head toward the stairs that led up and away. "You can get off," she said, "but if you do, don't answer any door that opens onto water." She paused, as if listening to a station announcement only she could hear. "And if you must answer, count the knocks and make sure they belong to your house." I looked at the journal, then at the brass plate, then at the shadow that could have been the sea beyond the end of the platform. The tall man with the walking stick stood, very small now, near the far lamp where the boards thinned. He did not turn. He didn't need to. He was the idea of farthest. I did not stand. I felt my body wanting to, like a tide deciding itself. But I didn't. I kept my hands on the journal, my eyes on the place where the condensation began to bead again along the bottom edge of the glass. The woman with the watch nodded once, as if I'd chosen the answer she would have chosen for me. She stepped back, and the lamp over her head dimmed to a heartbeat, and then the platform slid away like a page turned without a hand. The compartment's light settled. I stayed very still and listened to the train do what it does, be a place that is moving, and a movement that is a place. When at last the tunnel yielded to a more ordinary dark, the carriage eased into the city station, with the caution of something placing itself exactly where someone else expects to find it. The doors opened with the sigh of endings. Out on the platform, the cleaner pushed the same cart, the guard watched the same glass, and the clock held its hand in the space between 12 and 1 and seemed satisfied by the indecision. I stood. The journal was lighter now, as if it had put something down. I left it on the seat where I'd found it. I stepped out, and the air of the station took me back in without asking questions. At the top of the stairs, on the wall beside the broken clock, someone had pinned a curling notice about lost property. Under it, in neat block letters, a little sign read, "No official record exists of Greyford Station." A cleaner had traced a quiet line under the words with a thumb. It wasn't emphasis. It was recognition. I walked home. The streets had the feel of 3 a.m. when the city keeps only enough light to find its way to morning. My pockets held a sliver of ticket and the faint smell of varnish. Every now and then I caught the urge to count. 1, 2, 3, and I'd stop because counting is a way of saying yes. At my door I listened. No knocks, only the soft patience of my hallway and the way keys sound when you hold them too long in your hand. I turned mine, a small brass thing with teeth that never seemed sharp enough, and stepped in. On the table lay a map I didn't remember leaving open. Not a real one. A tourist fold-out with cheerful drawings of landmarks, the kind you get free at a hotel desk. Across its lower corner, someone had penciled a fine rectangle that didn't belong to the city at all. A pier. Posts like little black squares, a tiny cross at the farthest end. Next to the cross, a note in tidy script, "Stand where the map does not reach." I folded the map carefully and slid it into a drawer. I set my keys down so gently the metal didn't chime. I sat in the dark until the dark felt like a room I knew well. The next night, I went back to the station, and the night after that. Sometimes the red became amber. Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes the train came and didn't stop, sliding along the platform slow enough to read the numbers on the doors, fast enough to pretend it hadn't been there at all. Sometimes in the reflection of the glass, I saw the outline of a man who never needed to lift his eyes to see you. Sometimes I didn't see him, and that felt closer. I never stepped off at Greyford. But once, just once, I think I saw someone step on. A woman with damp cuffs and a pocket watch cupped like a small bird. She nodded to the open door as if greeting a neighbour. The lamp above her brightened the precise amount necessary to say welcome. The train sighed, the doors settled, and in the thin pause that followed I heard, from far away and out of sequence, three careful knocks. Story 3. The house by the river had been empty for years. Though in Greyford, empty didn't mean abandoned. The shutters were kept painted, the weeds cut back, the roof mended each spring, but no one could remember the last time its door had been unlocked. It sat at the bend where the river slowed before meeting the sea, and on still days you could see the tide hesitate there, as if uncertain which way it should move. I'd passed it 100 times without stopping. It was part of the scenery, one of those quiet fixtures in a small place that everyone assumes belongs to someone else. But in the summer I turned 38, I inherited the key. It came in an envelope without a return address, slipped under my door sometime before dawn. Inside was the key, brass, the teeth filed into an unfamiliar pattern, and a folded sheet of paper. One side was blank. On the other, in a narrow, deliberate hand, were 5 words, "The weather hasn't changed in weeks." There was no explanation, but the moment I held the key, I knew which door it belonged to. It had a weight to it, not heavy, but purposeful, the kind of object that knows exactly where it wants to be. I walked down to the bend that afternoon. The air was thick with heat and river silt, and the water under the stone bridge barely moved. The house sat as it always had. Windows shuttered, porch bare, a pale green door with paint flaking around the frame. The key slid in with the ease of long familiarity. The lock turned once, then twice, and the door opened onto a smell of cool wood and something faintly metallic. Inside, the air felt unchanged, not stale, not fresh, just fixed in place. Dust lay only in the corners, as if the centre of each room had been kept swept. The furniture was sparse but deliberate. A narrow bed in the back room, a desk with a single chair, a kitchen table that looked too small for company. On the table sat a small black leather-bound journal. I didn't touch it at first. Instead, I opened the shutters one by one, letting the river light in. The view from the kitchen window faced the bend directly, and I could see the tide making its small, indecisive circles. When I finally sat at the table, the journal felt warm against my palms. Its cover was worn smooth, and pressed into the leather, barely visible unless the light caught it, was the word, Greyford. The first page was dated September 9th, 1964. The entry was short. He was on the opposite bank tonight, walking along the edge, tapping the ground every third step. I stayed inside. The pages that followed were sporadic. Some months had no entries. Others had 3 or 4 in a week. All spoke of the same figure, a tall man with a walking stick, appearing along the riverbank during periods of still weather. Sometimes he was alone. Sometimes he paused as if speaking to someone just out of sight. Always the entries ended the same way. I stayed inside. In the middle of the book, tucked between 2 pages from the late 70s, I found a folded sheet of lined paper. It was a map, not of the river exactly, but of the bend where the house sat. 3 small X's were marked along the bank opposite the porch. Next to them, in faint pencil, "Not this side." That night I sat on the porch and listened to the water. It was quiet in the way a place is when it knows how to keep its own secrets. The tide made its small adjustments, and the air was so still I could hear the faint scrape of insects along the posts. Near midnight, a sound reached me. Faint at first, then clearer. 1 knock, 2, 3. It didn't come from the door. It came from the far bank, carried over the slow water. In the moonlight, a figure moved along the opposite edge, tall, coat hanging just above the reeds, walking stick in hand. He paused opposite the house. The ferrule of the stick tapped the ground once, twice, 3 times. Then he moved on, disappearing into the shadow of the bridge. The next morning, I found a new page in the journal. It hadn't been there before. When the measure reaches the river, it waits. The crossing is not always a bridge. I closed the book, but the words stayed with me all day. I didn't leave the house. I sat at the kitchen table, watching the bend, counting the hours between the tide's half-hearted turns. In the evening, I locked the door and left the shutters open. The air felt heavier, and the water's surface lay flat as a mirror. When the knocks came again, I counted them without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. This time, the figure didn't pass on. He stopped opposite the house and stood there for a long time, the walking stick resting lightly against the ground. In the dim light, I couldn't see his face, only the stillness of his outline. Somewhere deep in me, a part I didn't know how to listen to, I understood that the measure was nearly done. I didn't light the lamps that night. The river had a kind of light of its own, a pewter sheen that seemed to come from below rather than above, as if the water were remembering the sky. Through the open shutters, the bend made its slow, indecisive turn, and the house held its breath with me. On the table lay the key. Brass, familiar, teeth filed into that strange pattern that fit only 1 lock I knew. I turned it once in my palm, listening to the small ring it made against the wood when I set it down again. The journal rested open beside it, the ribbon laid diagonally like a gentle warning. From the far bank, 1 knock, 3. He stayed this time. He did not walk on. The shape of him was the shape of a certainty, a coat that didn't quite move in the air, that didn't quite move around it. The walking stick angled, then righted itself the way a metronome corrects. I kept my eyes level with the sill, so the window made a horizon I would not cross. The house made its small night noises. A board eased. The kettle remembered what it had done at noon and decided not to repeat it. The clock in the back room was quiet because there was nothing to count. I felt the familiar urge to speak out loud, to give the room a word that would keep it from slipping. The weather hasn't changed in weeks. The phrase sounded different, spoken here than in the city, different here than on a platform. In the house by the river, it landed like a fact set carefully on a shelf. When I looked back at the table, The journal had turned a page. I didn't see it move. It had simply chosen a new face to show. If he stops across from you twice, the third time is yours. The handwriting was that narrow, deliberate hand that had dated entries in the 1960s and 70s, punctuation exact, a line through every 7 as if numbers might misbehave without it. I pressed my thumb against the margin, the paper warm from the room rather than my skin. A tightness gathered under my breastbone, a soft rope drawn once, not cruelly. Across the water the ferrule touched earth. 1, 2, 3. He did not move on. I rose, moving in a way the house understood. Step, breath, hand to frame, no light, no scrape of chair, and stood just far enough back that the window could not turn my face into a thing that looked out. The figure inclined the smallest degree, as though measuring the distance between my caution and the door. The key on the table made no sound at all. In that quiet sound is something that waits to be allowed. I sat again, and because doing nothing feels more like doing something when hands are occupied, I took up the journal and let it find its weight in my lap. A map had crept up from the paper's fibres, not inked, simply revealed by attention. The bend. The opposite bank. 3 small X's where the pencil had once said, "Not this side," and now faintly a 4th mark, not an X, but a circle so thin it could have been the memory of a drop. The circle sat where my porch would be if the map had bothered to draw porches. I closed the book gently. Pause. "Not this side," I said for the river to hear. "Not this door." At the far bank, the walking stick lifted. I could not say whether the man lifted with it. The stick was its own kind of person. The ferrule hovered a heartbeat and then settled once. Not a tap, just a presence pressed to earth. The shape turned, went on, and vanished into the shadow of the bridge with the carefulness of someone who knows the dark personally. I slept because I had to. The sleep came in careful folds, the kind you can smooth back with your hand if called. The second evening, I opened every shutter before the light went thin. The river's surface held a skin of drift that moved without moving, a leaf that chose to be elsewhere, a thread of grass that considered its angle. I brewed tea and forgot to drink it. The cup's heat travelled to the wood and stayed there. He came before midnight. 1 knock, 2, 3. He stopped again, opposite the house, and in that pause I knew the third time was walking toward me like weather. I went to the door, not to open it, only to stand where opening would be a small motion rather than a thought. The key lay on the table within reach, half shadowed by the spine of the journal. The brass looked more like a word than a tool. I told myself this because it felt safer to think of objects as sentences. The journal turned another page. I knew without looking, there is a lightness in a room when a page lifts that a living thing can feel. If he measures the river 3 nights together, count your door. Another line below, in a different hand, impatient, count nothing. I smiled despite the fear. Greyford advice has always been like that. 2 truths you must hold without letting them touch. The knocks came again, closer now but not at the wood. They travelled as sound does when it is thinking of becoming touch. 1, 2, 3. I lifted the key and felt the teeth slide against my finger pads, the filed pattern like a broken thought smoothed by use. I set it back down. When the house became a stillness within a stillness, I spoke to the empty room the way one speaks to a child who stands too near the edge. "We will wait," I said. "We will not answer, not doors." Outside, the ferrule touched earth once, lightly. Then nothing. Morning made the river tin and the sky felted wool. I took the journal out to the porch steps and let the off-white of the page compare itself to the river's light. Ant trails made thin moving stitches along the edge of the topmost step, ignoring the larger pattern underfoot. I turned back pages until I found a small pasted clipping. Local man missing. Last seen at River Bend. No date, no byline, only a column of words in the clipped diction of old reports. The name, Arthur Talley, sat there like a borrowed coin, familiar because I'd held it once in a different story told in a different voice. Below the clipping, a line in the same municipal hand I'd seen in the station journal. Cross-reference, rail file. Weather noted as still. Door advised shut. I felt the peculiar closeness that comes when two unrelated rooms share a wall you cannot see. The train, the pier, the bend, the tally and the tally. I stood and looked down river toward the town. The signal mast at the far end of the harbour lifted its square like a gesture that could mean welcome or warning, depending on who remembers the code. Somewhere, a bell that should have been a bell decided to be a bowl of quiet instead. When the afternoon grew heavy and uncounted, I walked the opposite bank, not across the bridge. I didn't want the house to lose sight of me, but along my own side until the path climbed up to a low fence and then down to stone. From there, I watched my shuttered windows watch back. The porch looked so simple from across the water, a small square of wood raised on posts that knew their work. I found 3 marks in the soil opposite the steps, equidistant, shallow, recently made. Nothing else disturbed the ground. A thin ring of lighter dirt lay between the second and third, as if the feral had pressed a circle there and taken it away again. I stood exactly where the circle had been and felt nothing at all, which is to say, I felt the right thing. On a flat stone near the waterline, someone had carved a small rectangle, the shape you'd make if you were drawing a door when you were very young and believed doors did not need hinges. Beside it, faint and careful, stand where the map does not reach. I went home by the shorter path, and the house accepted me as if I returned each day from that exact walk. On the 3rd night the air seemed thinner to breathe, though the heaviness remained. That is a particular feeling a coastal town knows, the weight of nothing in your lungs. I set the key on the windowsill so its brass could drink what little light the sky would share. I left the journal closed. Sometimes not reading is a kind of reading. When he came, there was no sound at first, only a collected stillness like a room before a photograph. Then, 1, 2, 3. Closer than before, though no board in the porch moved, no stair gave itself away. A shape paused where the bank across answers the porch directly. The stick angled, the ferrule very nearly not touching. The door leaned cool against my palm from the other side. I kept that contact. Through the wood came a sense of measurement, not violence, not even insistence, only the quiet persistence of a surveyor's line extended to where it tries to end. The knocks did not come at the door. They arrived as a thought does when a person you love thinks of you while in another room. Countable, kindly spaced, refusing to be a command. I breathed in, slow. Out, slower. "We will not count," I whispered, violating both bits of advice at once. Then, more softly, "We will not answer a door that opens onto water." The house approved by doing nothing. Across, after a long, still minute, the ferrule made a circle with its own absence and withdrew. The figure turned without turning and went the way of reeds and bridge shadow. I did not move for some time. When I did, I put the key back on the table and fell asleep at the chair with my head pillowed in the cradle of my arm, the way we sleep when we have chosen not to dream. Days ran like a quiet river, separate, joined. The journal offered entries of its own choosing, a dated note about a winter where the sea stayed the same shade for a month and a half, a page from 1981 where someone wrote, "He will measure the streets," in a hand that looked like it belonged to a patient teacher, a loose slip, the corner of a train ticket bearing the word Greyford in a font no one uses now. When rain considered coming and chose otherwise, I walked the lane to the market for bread. The people there practiced the art of not saying the most important thing too loud. Mrs. Bell wrapped my loaf with care and did not ask how the house felt. The baker's wife rested a palm over my change until I met her eyes and then lifted her hand, making the coins ring like good news. Father Hal paused in the doorway long enough to press his thumb against the edge of a pocket watch he no longer wound, as if to remind himself what time had once agreed to be. "Shutters open?" he asked, as if asking after a cat. "During the day," I said. "Closed at night." He nodded, pleased without showing it. "Doors?" "Shut," I said. Counted, and then not. He smiled without teeth. "Good." He started to go and then came back as if he'd forgotten a small thing in the telling of a larger one. "If it comes to 4, he said quietly, "speak your name and the name of your house together. Not loud, just together." I carried the bread home like a little parcel of warm clarity. The 4th night was weatherless the way a blank page is blank. The river lay unwrinkled under a low sky that did not even pretend to colour. I lit one candle in the kitchen so the dark would know where to stand. The flame made a small sound that had nothing to do with fire and everything to do with attention. I set the key in the dish by the door. The dish was chipped. The chip made a small valley of shadow that pleased me. I opened the journal and found nothing new, and then found on looking twice that an old page had altered. Not the words, but the way they sat on the paper, as if they wanted to be read kindly. When the counting ends, the shape remains. I closed the book. He came exactly when the kettle would have boiled if I'd set it on. 1, 2, 3. A pause that could hold a town. And then a 4th sound. Not a knock, a settling. The way a footfall gentles when the person has remembered where they are. I put my palm flat to the door and felt the skin of the wood cool under my hand. Somewhere, the house found its name and held it ready. "Greyford House by the Bend," I whispered, hearing how silly and correct it sounded. Then, as Father Hal had advised, more quietly, I said my own name and the houses together, not asserting, only pairing, the way you might pair a spoon to the right cup. Silence, a true one. Not absence, presence that chooses to rest. Across the water something shifted. I could not see it, but I felt the distance change as if a line had been burned away from a map. The ferrule did not touch. The 4th sound did not repeat. The 3 returned, 1, 2, 3, a kinder rhythm, like a courtesy bow at the end of a dance to show no harm had been meant. I breathed. The candle acknowledged by standing exactly as tall as before. The river acknowledged by deciding to move one leaf toward the bridge. After a time, the figure went on. I did not watch. I had made watching small. That was my work. The next morning, a page had been tucked under the journal's cover like a note left by a careful guest. On it, in the precise hand, some doors are not refusals, they are acknowledgements. Below, in that hurried script I had come to fondly mistrust, "We are measured to the size of what we keep safe." I laughed, soft enough not to interfere with the wood's memory. On impulse, I opened the drawer where I had once placed a cheerful tourist map of the city. I spread it on the table and in pencil drew a small rectangle at the bend where my porch would be if the city had thought to include us. I put a tiny cross on the opposite bank and wrote, as others had written, "Not this side." Then I turned the paper and wrote 3 names in a column: Tally, Cutter, Price. Under them, Cutter's Dock. Platform 7, the Bend. Under that, as if making a grocery list, ribbons on doors, chalk line, pocket watch. I folded the map and set it beneath the dish with the key, like a placemat for whatever would come next. The day passed in a clean, usable way. I mended a hinge, swept the porch boards, oiled the lock because the key deserved respect. In the evening I walked as far as the bridge and stood midway to look both ways. Upriver, the town held its roofs like hands. Downriver, the harbour cupped the stalled sea, like someone saving a place for someone else. The weather had not changed. It had, however, remembered how to be companionable. On the week's last night, if weeks could be trusted, a different visitor came. Not the figure with the stick, not the considerate silence of counting, but a woman in a neat coat who paused at the gate as if she'd known where it was all along. She did not lift the latch. She only rested her fingers on it lightly, the way one might greet a sleeping dog. "May I sit?" she asked, though she hadn't crossed onto the porch. Her voice reminded me of the sound a pocket watch makes when it is not ticking. I nodded and pulled a chair forward with care. The wood answered politely. She sat without haste. Up close I saw her cuffs were faintly damp, though the river air was not wet enough to do it. In her palm lay an oval of brass, thin as if many thumbs had pressed it over years. A watch, yes, but the hands had drifted to the margin together and were resting there, as if lateness in the right place were an art. "You've been here a while," she said, looking not at me but at the door. "A while," I agreed. "And the weather?" Her mouth quirked without deciding to smile. "It hasn't changed in weeks," I said, finding I cared for the sentence. She turned the watch once. Its face accepted the river light and made it domestic. "Do you intend to keep the house?" she asked. "It was given to me," I said. "I meant to keep it until it told me to move on." "That's how we do it," she said. "Keep what keeps." She set the watch on the table. It made the smallest sound, the sound of weight remembering that it is not a burden. "Don't answer any door that opens onto water," she said, almost playful. Then, more earnest, as if she were reciting an instruction she herself honoured, "If a fourth knock comes, pair your name with the house. If a circle is pressed and taken back, stand in it only if you know the difference between nothing and whole." "I think I do," I said, "on good days." She considered this as if it were weather. That's all any of us get. Good days enough. She stood, placed the watch back in her palm, and tipped the brim of a hat she was not wearing. It still felt like a hat. She walked back to the gate and did not open it, only passed through the place where a gate admits those who already belong. When she had gone, I realized I hadn't asked her name. But I had the sense that if I wrote A. Price on a slip of paper and left it under the dish with the key, the house would nod as if I'd remembered correctly. After that, the measure changed shape. It did not end, because measures do not end. They arrive at usefulness. The figure by the far bank still walked sometimes, less often, and when he paused opposite the house, I felt less like a mark being aligned and more like a post that had found its exact depth. The knocks came rarely. When they did, I counted to 3 without counting. Breath, breath, breath. Doors stayed shut with the dignity of doors that know they are not invitations, merely outlines. I learned the house's small language, how the back room brightens toward a sky that cannot be seen, how the porch boards report on who has visited, bird, fox, river cat, how the lock will tell you if you have turned the key too firmly or not enough. On cold mornings, a line of moisture gathers along the inner lip of the sill. If touched with a fingertip, it breaks into a scatter, like a map deleted kindly. I wrote in the journal because the journal wanted writing. I did not expect it to do anything in return. I dated my entries without cleverness, lettered plainly, and left space between lines so another hand might find room. I added a detail when I had it, and when I didn't, I wrote, "I stayed inside." That sentence became, to my surprise, a kind of prayer. Sometimes I walked to the harbour to stand where other stories had once decided to be told. The posts at the far end are still posts. If you look closely, you can see 3 small uniform indentations on one, newer than they look. People have tied ribbons to doors again, not out of fear, but because asking is a way of belonging. At the church, the stick in the glass case remains a stick. No plaque explains it. The absence of an explanation is the explanation. One afternoon, I took the bus to the city and sat on a bench on platform 7. The clock's minute hand had not chosen. The rails held the light the way old photos hold a day. A cleaner pushed a cart. A guard watched glass. I liked all of them for being faithful to their tasks. I did not wait for anything particular. When I left, I pinched a forgotten ticket stub from the floor and slid it into my pocket. It said low in a font that could belong to either water or time. Back at the house, I tucked the stub between a journal page where someone had written, "Stand where the map does not reach." The paper and the paper agreed with each other. That agreement felt like a blessing. On the day the weather changed, not violently, not even dramatically, simply changed, it announced itself with a sound like someone smoothing a sleeve. The river lifted enough that its skin showed a texture. A wind visited without asking to stay. Leaves reconsidered their positions in the learned choreography of trees. The house sighed as if 2 boards pressed together had remembered being one tree long ago. That evening, I opened every window and let the rooms taste what they had been missing. The candle flame grew playful and was forgiven. I set the key upright in the chipped dish and it leaned against the rim like a person in a doorway, not deciding to come in or go. At the far bank, no figure appeared. The path under the reeds showed 3 neat marks that would, by morning, be softened by the small feet of river birds. The bridge's shadow shifted and did not hoard. I wrote, "The weather has changed." Then, because I had come to prefer it for sleep, I added beneath, "We kept inside until we could open everything." I closed the journal. The cover's press of the word Greyford caught the last of the day and let it go. Before I went to bed, I placed the brass key on the journal as if it were a paperweight, though no draught wandered. The teeth set into the leather's soft depression with a rightness that required no witness. I slept as if I had done a small exact job and finished it at the proper hour. In the weeks after, people in town spoke more easily without saying more. Mrs. Bell laughed at the right part of a story without needing the story. The baker's wife hung a ribbon on the hinge of her shop as decoration, and no one read it for anything else. Father Hal began winding his watch again, not to tell time precisely, but to enjoy a thing made to run. I kept the house. The porch boards silvery in sun, the lock oiled on the first day of each month, shutters hinged to rest against the wall. On still afternoons I sit with the door open, not as an invitation, but as a statement of trust. When the air grows heavy in that old familiar way, I close it with the same trust and turn the key. I have grown fond of the soft sound the key makes when the lock, and I agree. Sometimes a knock comes from a long way off, a courteous echo, 1, 2, 3, timed with a tide I no longer monitor with fear. I count without counting. The door stays where a door should be. On very quiet nights, I think I hear a train that doesn't exist pass a platform that sometimes does. I imagine a woman with damp cuffs and a pocket watch stepping down just to feel a different air on her face. I imagine her stepping back before anyone can ask a hard question. If I walk to the far end of the harbour at dusk, a man might stand where boards narrow and water waits. He leans without leaning. He measures without touching. If I look only with the corners of my eyes, I notice he is less a person than a way the world remembers to be exact. I nod in his direction, the way you nod to the keeper of any ledger that helps a town sleep. I go home the long way, past doors that belong to people who know what they're doing. Ribbons that mean only ribbons. Chalk lines that rain has taken and no one misses. The house meets me where I left it. The bend keeps its bend. When I set the key down, I like to rest it on a folded map that does not include us. The weight is pleasant. The map and the key and the book agree to be quiet together. At the end of the night, before I blow out the candle, I sometimes sail a river, for the town, for the part of me that listens. The weather hasn't changed in weeks. And then I add, as a kindness to sleep, it will in the morning. Story 4. The lighthouse on Bracken Point hadn't been lit in years. Yet every so often someone claimed to see its beams sweep the harbour in the hours before dawn. It stood on a narrow spit of rock 2 miles beyond Greyford's outer shoals, reachable only at low tide by a causeway of wet stone and weed-slick timbers. From the town's edge, you could just make out its white tower leaning slightly toward the water, its glass top clouded like an old bottle. I'd grown up with it as a constant shape on the horizon, a marker for where the coast ended and the deeper water began, but I'd never stepped inside. The tide was too unpredictable, and the causeway, they said, had a way of disappearing under your feet even when the water was still. Then, one early autumn afternoon, a letter came. It was slipped under my door the way the river house key had been years before, only this time there was no key, just a folded page from a ledger. On one side, a list of dates spanning 5 decades, each paired with a single word, beam. On the other, in the same narrow, deliberate hand I'd come to recognize, the weather hasn't changed in weeks. The causeway will be clear. There was no signature, but tucked between the fold was a torn scrap of leather, black, worn smooth, the corner of a book's cover. I didn't need to be told which book. I left at low tide, boots slick with the salt that never truly leaves. The causeway stretched out like a thought you weren't sure you should follow, planks warped and dark with age, stones shifting slightly under my weight. The air was still, the gulls low. Halfway across, I paused and looked back. Greyford sat quiet under a pale sky, its roofs flat in the light. The tower loomed ahead, taller now, its lean more pronounced up close. The iron door at its base was unlatched. It opened inward with a groan that seemed too soft for its size. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of rope and rain. The spiral stairs rose into shadow. On the first landing, a small table held a lantern, unlit but warm to the touch. Beside it lay a journal. Black leather. Familiar. I lifted the journal and felt the familiar give of leather that has known hands. Its cover bore the faint pressed word, Greyford, though time had softened it until the letters were more suggestion than text. Dust didn't cling to it. The pages held their own air, as if the book exhaled separately from the room. I didn't open it yet. The stairs measured the tower in careful turns, each step cupped from years of boots and wind. I climbed with my palm to the inner wall, where the stone was cool and slightly damp. Halfway up, the light changed. Not brighter, just clearer, the way a pond surface clarifies when you stop walking the bank. On the second landing, a slit window looked east. Through it, the tide lay like a sheet pulled smooth. Far below, the causeway showed its ribs in neat, stubborn lines. I could have reached out and laid my fingers on time. From somewhere above, one tap, two, three. So faint I wasn't sure I'd heard anything at all. I started up again. The third landing held a small wooden chair and a brass plate screwed to the wall. The plate had been polished recently. The names on it were legible in the dim. A. Tally, Keeper W. Price. Assistant J. Morley. Night Watch names the town knows the way a hand knows its ring. I touched each with a finger, then kept climbing. At the top, the observation room waited under the glass. The lens was still, its prisms dulled with a film-like breath on winter glass. From here, the horizon drew a clean line, and the harbour, in miniature, tucked itself under the town like a child under a coat. The lantern on the first landing had warmed the air somehow, though no flame burned here. In the middle of the room, on a narrow round table, lay another object I recognized without ever seeing before. A pocket watch, thin and oval, hands resting together at the edge like two people who have agreed not to move until spoken to. I set the journal beside it and finally opened to the ribbon. The first page held a date, October 2nd, 1972. The hand was narrow, the letters leaning toward one another as if in quiet conversation. He walks the lower gallery when fog sits under the lens, counts the bolts in the rail, touches the glass with the ferrule as if not to wake it. A second entry followed, same day, written darker, the nib pressed harder. If the beam sweeps when oil is cold and wicks are dry, remain. Doors shut. Do not climb down. The stairs do not belong to you then. I looked up at the glass, at my fogged reflection cut into panes. The tower made a low sound, not a groan, not wind, the sound of a stack of books settling exactly square. I turned a page. The ink changed colour, older, browner. The weather hasn't changed in weeks. The causeway lies clear. I saw him at the foot of the stairs. He did not climb. He tapped. 3. A small diagram followed. A circle for the lantern room, a ring for the gallery, a tiny cross on the west side with a note. Not this door. I breathed in and caught the faintest scent of oil that wasn't there. The watch on the table ticked once, not a series of ticks. 1. It sounded like a word deciding not to be said. I stepped to the window and looked down the spiral of the outer gallery, the narrow ring of walkway that ran around the lamp room, protected by a waist-high iron rail, bolted at regular intervals. The bolts had a bloom of rust where long fingers of damp reached and withdrew. Movement on the gallery's far side, not shape exactly. An understanding, the kind of knowledge that enters a room without using the door. Evening, I said softly, out of habit as much as courtesy. The ferrule touched iron, barely. I felt it through my feet, a polite inquiry travelling metal to bone. I did not open the hatch to the gallery. I kept my hands where the tower could see them. Below, the water thought about turning. On the horizon, a line of vapour formed. Not fog, not cloud. Something the lens would like to see. I turned a few more pages, letting the journal choose. Here were lists, dates and the single word beam. The same ledger marks from the letter under my door. Here were notes about wick trimming and weather glass readings, steady hands managing ordinary work in an extraordinary calm. Here a different hand again, municipal, tidy. Case addendum, intermittent reports of light sweep at Bracken Point during periods of still weather. Power disconnected 1969. Verify, keeper logs missing from 1970-93, Morley night notes unfiled. Advise, observe, do not ascend during false sweep. I set the journal down. The glass above me changed its mind. A pale glow gathered somewhere that was not the sky, eddied through prism, and laid itself as a faint belt across the inner wall, a shadow of a beam, the memory of a sweep. The watch ticked once more, then settled back to its pleasant abstention. From the stairwell, 1 knock, 2, 3, clearer this time, counted by stone. I went to the hatch that opens to the gallery and ran my hand along the bolt heads on the inside rim. Smooth, equidistant, exact. I could feel the measure in my skin, the way you feel a low hum through your teeth. Not this door, I said gently to the iron. Not tonight. The light, if light is the word, drew a paler belt and then let it fade. I sat on the floor with my back to the table, the watch and journal at my shoulder, and listened to a room that knows how to be quiet do exactly that. I stayed until the colours refused to make difference and then stayed past that. The tide turned, admitting the admission with a single soft bark of water at rock far below. The beam did not sweep again. The tower, grateful for being looked at, relaxed its small noises. At dawn, if dawn applies when weeks refuse change, I climbed down 2 landings and stopped where the slit window faces west. Across the harbour, Greyford kept its roofs and its attitude. Out beyond the causeway, the sea pretended to ruffle, then thought better. On the first landing, I picked up the lantern and found it lighter than it should be. The wick was intact, the glass clean. A small note lay under the base in precise hand. Oil absent. If lamplights do nothing. I set it back. At the bottom, the iron door lifted a fraction on its hinges without help. I didn't step out. I stood in the threshold and looked at the seam where rock becomes causeway and causeway becomes the long, low line to land. There, 3 clean marks in a row on the timber nearest the door, shallow as a careful map. A 4th, perhaps, had been pressed and taken back. I could not see it, but the absence sat where it would have been like a chair no one had pulled out. "Good morning," I said to the space. The ferrule hesitated, then tapped earth once like the idea of a bow. I crossed at low tide, taking care where the weed makes a boot reconsider. Halfway, I stopped to look back the way I had on the way out. From here, the tower leaned less. The glass seemed simply to be sky made thoughtful. At the town's edge, Mrs. Bell stood outside her shop, breathing the hour. She did not ask where I had been, only wiped an invisible place on her apron and nodded toward my pocket, where the corner of the journal showed. "Beam?" she asked. "Only the idea of one," I said. "That's enough to see by," she replied, and let me choose my own smile. That night, I returned with a coil of rope out of respect for the causeway's moods. The air held the same weight it had held all week, the gulls stitching low loops over mud that would not yet be water. I made the crossing with a pace that the sea and I both approved. The door opened as if it had been touched from the inside. On the first landing, the lantern felt warmer. On the table in the lamp room, the watch had shifted, not far, a half-inch of suggestion. The hands still weighted together at the margin. I opened the journal to a new page. The ink looked just then dry. If you see the beam, close your eyes at the turn. You do not need to follow to know it has passed. Another line beneath the hurried hand. He has begun to count the glass. I put my palm to the prism. Cold. No moisture under my skin. From the gallery. 1 tap, 2, 3, then the faintest scrape as if a circle had been drawn and lifted, leaving only its intention. The watch ticked once. The room's centre leaned a fraction toward the sea and righted itself. I closed my eyes at the turn that was not there. In the dark behind my lids I saw the harbour's curve, the pier's far post with its uniform marks, the chalk line once drawn down the town's main street, the small rectangle carved near the river bend. The brass plate with names that refused to be only names, all of it part of a larger measure that did not demand, only described. "I am here," I said quietly, and paired my name with the lighthouses, unsure how to phrase such a thing and doing it anyway. "At Bracken Point." The room relaxed. The glass did not beam. The watch did not tick. Nothing dramatic happened, which is the point of a tower that has done its job. I slept on the floor with my coat under my head and woke to the sound of a kettle that wasn't there deciding not to boil. On the third evening, weather gathered as a thought rather than a front. That is sometimes how change comes to a coast, privately, in rooms that have windows. The knock from below arrived early. 1, 2, 3. No pause for a fourth, a grace. When I stepped to the hatch, the world outside the glass had blurred to a silver that made all distances gentle. The causeway lay clear but looked thoughtful about its future. On the gallery, a wetness filmed the bolts in a neat line. The ferrule lifted and set down once without marking, the circle that means nothing and whole in the same breath. I did not open the hatch. I laid the key I had brought, not to the lighthouse, but to the river house, because I carry it now like a word I like on the watch, and the two brass faces considered each other until they agreed to share weight. In the journal I wrote, "I stayed inside." Then on the next line, "The beam did not sweep." Then under that, "We were seen anyway." I closed the book and the room seemed to make the same gesture. When weather finally changed, not with rain but with movement, it was the harbour that told us. Bells that had been bowls of quiet became bells again. Lines that had drooped for weeks took up their work. The gulls flew higher and stopped reading our shoulders for news. I crossed at low tide one last time and stood at the landward end of the causeway while the water thought about returning to take its own shape. The tower leaned in its old way. The glass kept the sky it had been given. At the door I left the journal where I had found it, under the polite company of dust that is not really dust. I set the pocket watch beside it, its hands still at the margin, as content with their stilled permission as any running engine could be. On the brass plate I pressed my thumb beside the names, Tally, Price, Morley, not to claim, only to remember. "Thank you," I said to the room. The room answered by admitting me back to the stairs, which is how towers say you may go. On the causeway I looked back once, as we always do, and saw, or believed I saw, a pale belt of light revolve once within the glass and choose not to leave the room. Not a warning, an acknowledgement. In town, Mrs. Bell had tied a ribbon to her latch in a colour the harbour likes. Father Howell walked with his stick. Not a measuring stick, just the sort that keeps a man's back friendly. At the market, the baker's wife lifted a loaf and said, "For the walk," though I hadn't told her I'd been walking. At the river bend, I set the key on the folded map under the chipped dish, and it looked perfectly at home. The house inhaled once as twilight arrived, as if the walls had learned something new about breath. I wrote one more line in my own notebook, not the journal, just mine. The weather hasn't changed in weeks then, after a space large enough to hold the sea, but it can decide to. Story 5. In the centre of Greyford's oldest cemetery stood a tree that bloomed out of season. Its blossoms were small and white, never more than a few at a time, but they came in the still months, when the air felt heavy and the tide refused to turn. The oldest gravestones leaned toward it, their inscriptions thinned by years of salt wind and lichen. No one in town could say for certain what kind of tree it was. Some called it hawthorn, others pear, but no one had seen fruit, only the blossoms. The groundskeeper, Mr. Elby, swore it had been there when his grandfather was a boy, and his grandfather said the same about his own time. The roots, it was said, went deeper than the graves. I first noticed the tree one winter afternoon, when the sky had pressed itself into a single shade of grey. I'd gone to the cemetery with a notebook, intending to copy down some names for a bit of local history research, but instead I found myself walking toward the blooms. They seemed to gather the dull light, as if it were their duty to keep a certain kind of brightness alive when everything else refused. At the base of the tree was a bench of old rough wood. On it lay a book, black leather, edges softened, the word Greyford faint in the grain. It was open to a page written in the narrow, deliberate hand I'd seen before. He walks between the stones when the ground holds no frost, taps the base of each marker 3 times, pauses where roots cross under. The entry was dated 30 years ago to the day. I sat on the bench and let the cold find the space between my coat and my wrists. The cemetery's quiet was different from the harbours, different from the rivers. It was layered, a hush built of many small silences agreeing with one another. Somewhere a gate clicked once and settled. The journal's next line waited where my fingers had stopped. Do not follow him if he passes your name. Let your name do its own work. I traced the margin with a thumb, the paper soft with a kind of careful use. The tree's bark had a braided look near the ground, as if the trunk remembered the shape of rope. Roots shouldered up here and there through the soil, making small humps between stones. A windless flutter, and one white petal slipped down, turning slowly, landing on the open page without a sound. I left it where it fell. From between the rows, 1 tap, 2, 3, faint, deliberate, as if the ground itself had learned to count. I did not look right away. I let the sound be a shape first. When I finally lifted my eyes, I saw him the way I have learned to see him, not as a face, but as a condition. A tall coat, a brim that turns shadows into a courtesy, a walking stick whose ferrule knows where to stop. He moved along the path that wasn't a path, touching the base of certain stones, not all, with a light, precise rhythm. At some, he paused with a stillness that read like thought. At others, he passed without slowing. When he reached the tree, he inclined slightly as though acknowledging a keeper, and set the ferrule to the exposed root with a touch that left no mark. I lowered my gaze to the names at my knees. The oldest stones had surrendered their letters to lichen and rain. Others kept their lines like careful handwriting. On one slab, barely legible, a family name I recognized from old ledgers. Tally. On another, the mason's chisel had cut Morley with a hand that preferred square corners. Farther along, a small, tidy stone, Annette W. Price, with no dates, only a narrow notch where a bird liked to perch. The man with the stick paused between Tally and Price, where a root ran like a vein from the tree's base toward the hill. He touched the ground once, twice, 3 times, then lifted the ferrule the smallest degree and held it hovering, a circle poised and unmade. The petal on the page trembled, though the air did not. I turned the leaf carefully and found a pressed sprig, old blossoms flattened into a pale echo, taped there with yellowing corners. Beneath, in the small municipal hand I'd seen in other places, notes re out-of-season tree. Bloom intervals coincide with still weather episodes. Foot traffic patterns suggest nocturnal visitation. 3-tap sequence. Advise, doors shut, names left unspoken. On the facing page, the narrow, deliberate hand returned. If you must speak, speak to the ground. It's the ground that remembers for us. The taps moved on, 3 at a time, with the patience of a person aligning type in a drawer. He did not look at me. He never does. That is a mercy. He stopped near the western wall where the stones grow simpler. There, among markers cut by unpracticed hands, a small rectangle of slate leaned inward. I could not read the name, only the last letter, D, like the end of a breath. The ferrule touched slate, not soil, 3 times. The sound was clear and kind. Good evening, I said, to the bench, to the slate that had leaned so long it had learned the angle by heart. The stick lifted. The figure went on. The counting continued. 1, 2, 3, and somewhere among those stones a 4th almost arrived and then decided not to. A pocket watch lay half buried near the tree, its chain a thin rusting line, its face clouded. Without thinking, I pinched it from the soil and turned it in my palm. The glass was cracked corner to center. The hands rested together at the margin as if they had gone there to listen. On the back, scratched neatly by someone with time to be careful, a word, Greyford. I set it on the bench beside the journal. The 2 old things recognized one another, the way ships do with their horns when fog rises. The groundskeeper's footsteps sounded from the gate. the slow, uneven rhythm of a man who has learned to walk with Earth's kindnesses and limits. Mr. Elby lifted a hand the way people lift a hand in places where voices are for later. He joined me without asking. "Bloom's early," he said, as if continuing a conversation we had started last winter. "Bloom's late. Blooms when it needs to." I nodded toward the tree. "Do you prune?" He shook his head. "Would you comb a river?" His gaze dropped to the journal, the watch. He did not touch either. "You'll hear him tonight," he said softly. "You'll want to count, let the ground do it. That's its job." "I know," I said, meaning I was trying. We sat there until the light deepened from one grey to a different grey. When he left, his hand brushed the bench's rough edge with a tenderness that made me think of elbows on kitchen tables and children told to sit still in church pews. Dusk in a cemetery has its own grammar. The birds go quiet a fraction before any clock would think to mark it. The trees keep their colour but not their edges. Names sink in place and stop asking to be read. I closed the journal and set the watch on top of it as if the face might like the feel of leather. He came when he meant to, which is always earlier than you think and later than you fear. 1 tap, 2, 3. This time he came up the central path where the oldest stones make a kind of corridor. He did not enter the corridor. He took its measure from the threshold the way a surveyor respects old boundaries. He paused at the tree. The ferrule touched root once and held a fraction above, the way a person might hover a pen over a line they aren't ready to write. Then he turned toward the bench. Not at me, near. He stopped where the ground, lifted by a root, made a small hillock in the grass. "Not this door," I said, because habit helps courage into the room. "Not this side." He inclined infinitesimally and set the ferrule down without tapping, a circle pressed and taken back. The air thinned, the way air does when a weather change is thinking itself through. A petal loosened and fell, landing on my sleeve like a small gold sensible snow that didn't melt. The figure moved on and counted 3 at the base of a plain stone that had no name at all, only a shallow curve at the top where the mason had changed his mind. I lifted the watch and turned it so the face met the last of the day. For a brief, very ordinary second, the hands seemed to quiver toward their numbers and then rest again at the margin. I set it back down. The bench accepted the small weight. On the ground by my boot, something gleamed faintly, the tip of a small brass key, dulled by years in soil. My fingers found it like you find a coin in an old coat. The teeth were filed oddly, the shaft short, a key that belonged to a drawer or a box rather than a door. I rubbed the dirt away with the corner of my sleeve. On the bow, barely there, the pressed word again, Greyford. It should have felt like too much. It felt instead like a pattern remembering itself. The journal opened to a page I didn't turn. The neat hand had left me a sentence in the margin beside a drawing of roots. "If you find a key, let it weigh your name for you." I set the small key on my palm and spoke, not out loud enough to wake, only to name my own name, then the name I had been using for the river house, then the notion of this place that had never needed my help to be true. The tree at Greyford's cemetery, the bench, the stones that lean and are forgiven. The key sat easily through the words and then lay quieter, as if reminded of its purpose. From somewhere in the oldest row came a 4th sound, not a tap, a settling. The sound a root makes in a person's memory when it chooses where to turn. I did not look. I listened to the ground complete a shape it had been drawing for years and smiled because I had been allowed to overhear. I went to the cemetery every evening for a week. I told no one. Mr. Elby nods without needing to ask. The Blooms came and went as if they had errands elsewhere. The journal offered me dates and little maps, rectangles drawn in pencil where the path narrows, a small cross at the base of the tree, a note in the municipal hand. Cross-reference, rail file, harbour posts, river bend, lighthouse beam. Under it, in a friendlier scrawl, all the same patience. On the 4th night, rain thought about arriving and left a quiet dampness in the air that made the world seem newly varnished. The man with the stick walked the far row where stones had been little more than markers, and with his 3 taps gave them, for a moment, the dignity of proper names. He paused at an uncut rock set into the earth at a careful tilt and leaned as though reading an inscription that existed only at a depth we can't see. He lifted the ferrule and let it hover, circling nothing, saying whole. I didn't count that night. I counted my breaths the way one does when sleep is near and must be invited rather than chased. 3 in a set, then another set, then another, until numbers turned into resting. A woman came once and sat at the far end of the bench. Her cuffs were a little damp, though the evening was dry. She cupped something in her palm. I didn't need to see it to know its shape. "The weather hasn't changed in weeks," she said, almost cheerfully, as if reporting a neighbour's good health. "It will," I said, because I had learned to add that when kindness seemed required. She nodded, the agreement of someone who has already made the crossing and still visits the shore. We watched a petal fall and let quiet do its work. When change came, it started below my feet. The ground lost a degree of its stillness. Not restlessness, precisely, more like readiness. The tree adjusted its weight by some fraction imperceptible to eyes. The bench's wood released a scent of old sap and sun. The names on the stones brightened a little, as if the day had decided to remember them from a closer distance. I opened the journal to a blank page and wrote only this: "We did not follow. We were followed by quiet, and that was enough." Then, after a breath long enough to hold a small bell's ring, I added, "If someone walks between your names, let them count. Your work is to stay." I closed the book and tucked the little brass key under its ribbon, the way you might tuck a note into a pocket for later. The watch I left on the bench with its face up, trusting the tree to keep time more kindly than any clock. He passed once more that evening. 1 tap, 2, 3. He paused at the tree and touched the ferrule to the root and did not lift it. The circle pressed, the circle taken back, the circle left behind in the air like a halo that knew better than to show itself. "Good night," I said to the earth, because that is where the words belong. The figure went on, not to leave, I don't think he ever leaves, but to continue the task that continues him. I walked home by the long lane past Mrs. Bell's window, past the church where Father Hal sometimes winds a watch for the pleasure of winding, past doors that have learned the art of being doors. In the drawer by my table I laid the small key beside a folded map that does not include the cemetery, the river, or the harbour, because it was printed for visitors who need different comforts. The key's weight steadied the paper into a more honest shape. Before sleep, I said the words that help the dark fold smooth. The weather hasn't changed in weeks. It will in the morning. I kept my name, and it kept me. The ground did the counting. The tree, in its unseasonable wisdom, kept its few bright blossoms for exactly as long as we needed to remember how to rest. Story 6. At the edge of Greyford, where the road to the hills curves sharply and loses its paving, there is a building people call the Exchange. No one seems certain what it used to be. Some say it was once a telegraph office, others a way station for coaches that never ran on schedule. Its windows are always shuttered, its sign a blank rectangle of weathered wood. But once in a while, always in the long stretches when the tide refuses to move, light can be seen through the slats, a pale, low glow, as if the air inside had remembered how to be daylight for just a moment. I had walked past it many times without slowing. The gravel there has a habit of crunching too loudly underfoot, and the hedges seemed to lean in as if listening. But one still evening, as I was making my way home from the hills, I saw something propped against the Exchange's closed door. It was a journal. Small, black leather, edges softened. The word Greyford faint where the cover caught the light. I knelt to pick it up, half expecting the hinges of the door to sigh at my closeness. The journal was warm, as if it had been sitting in a shaft of light that didn't belong to the hour. Its leather had the give of something carried in a coat for years. Across the cover, the pressed word Greyford rose only when the angle took it. I stood, listening to the hedge lean and the gravel settle. Far off, A car took the turn at the top of the hill and let its engine go quiet after, as if the road had asked for that favour. I turned the journal over in my hands and opened to the ribbon. The first page held a line, in that narrow, deliberate hand that had visited so many rooms in this town. The weather hasn't changed in weeks. If the exchange lights, do not knock. A breath of cool air slipped through the shutter slats, not a wind, only the proof of space. I glanced up at the sign above the door, the blank board that had once held a name. It was neither welcoming nor forbidding. It just remembered the shape of words. On the step beside my boot lay a short length of wire, curled on itself 3 times like a thought deciding to end. I set the journal under my arm, cupped a hand to the slats, and peered in. Dust hung in the low interior light like a slow snow that had changed its mind. Shelves lined the walls, pigeonholes with old numbers stenciled in an orderly hand. A counter sat at the back with a small brass bell and a black device that might have been a telegraph key, its lever poised as if expecting a finger. The door was not latched. It opened the distance doors do when they remember they were made for it. I stepped inside. The floor carried the sound of my weight in a soft wooden way. In the side room, a pocket watch rested on an invoice spike beside a glass paperweight shaped like a lens. The watch's hands met at the margin and stayed there, content with their small agreement. The paperweight held an air bubble in its middle like a captured breath. On the counter lay a folded map of the county, not the cheerful kind for visitors, but a working map with margins written in pencil, lines added where lanes had been widened or misremembered. A rectangle had been drawn around Greyford, precise and neat. Along the bottom, a ruler's tiny ticks marched to exactly 3. Beside them, in a municipal hand I knew, out-of-hours exchange, still weather intervals only. The bell gave a tremor, not a ring, a courtesy. From somewhere behind the counter came a sound that lived between tapping and breath. 1, 2, 3. I kept my palms flat on the counter so the room could see them. Evening, I said, because politeness keeps places from hardening. The tapping resumed, a patient pattern that touched down, lifted and touched again. Not Morse exactly, though the rhythm might have been distant cousins with it. More like someone knocking on a table to count an invisible set of coins. I tilted my head and listened. The interval between each set felt equal and kind. On the wall behind the counter a slate hung on a nail. A faint chalk line divided it. On one side were names laid in a tidy column. Tally, Morley, Price, and beneath them a few I did not know. On the other side a shorter list I did know by the shape of the letters, my name among them, written with the care of a person who does not want to smudge. I set the journal beside the map and flipped to the next page. He will not enter. He will count the drawers. A pencil diagram of the pigeonholes followed, rows and columns with small circles drawn in certain squares, counted spaces. Not all. Only some. I walked the wall slowly, reading the old stencils, 1 through 40 on the top row, 41 through 80 below. In the third row the numbers ran to a neat 100. A few drawers were pulled a fraction, as if someone had checked them and left them undecided. I touched none of them. The air in the room felt like a held answer. The tapping paused, then resumed nearer, travelling the counter the way a person sometimes moves a glass without sliding it. 1, 2, 3. The telegraph key trembled, the barest settle, and was still. Not this door, I said to the quiet out of habit that had become a way of staying inside my name. Not tonight. The room approved by staying itself. On the shelf behind the counter sat a small brass-handled drawer, different from the numbered ones, the size of a dictionary cut in half. The handle's bow had the faint pressed word again, Greyford. I did not touch it. Instead, I looked down at the journal. A new line had arrived, neat as a letter delivered under a real door. If a key appears, it belongs to nothing you can open. Use it to weigh the paper. I smiled, a small, sleep-appropriate smile. In the corner of the counter lay a little brass key, dull with a patient tarnish. I placed it on the map's lower edge, and the paper settled into the wood as if that had been its wish. For a while I did nothing in a purposeful way. I listened to the exchange do the work of a place that remembers other people's messages, shelves tolerating dust, floorboards remembering feet, the bell agreeing to remain unstruck. The tapping travelled the wall of drawers and paused at certain numbers, 7, 12, 33, then moved on. When it reached the brass-handled drawer with Greyford pressed into the bow, it did not tap. It hovered, the circle that meant nothing and whole at the same time. I turned the map. On its reverse, a penciled rectangle showed a pier, a narrow platform, a river bend, a causeway, a little collage of places that knew each other without introductions. In its corner, a small label in block letters read "Exchange, low." I liked the joke, if joke it was. The pocket watch ticked once. The air thickened by a degree that didn't trouble breathing. A pale light moved along the shutter slats the way a thought crosses a forehead. The bell rang then, not the whole bell, only the idea of it. A single, true note that did not invite an answer. "Evening," someone said from the doorway, a voice like a man who has learned to walk softly because houses deserve it. I turned. Mr. Elby, the cemetery groundskeeper, stood with his hat in his hands. I had never seen him inside the exchange, which made his presence seem exactly right. He nodded to the bell, to the key, to the journal, as if counting a small inventory of things that belong in sentences with one another. "You'll want to write," he said, very gently, as though it were a suggestion from the room rather than himself. I set the journal open and waited. Ink that had not been there a moment before curled itself into letters on the top line. "The weather hasn't changed in weeks." Under it, my hand, a different weight, added, "I stayed inside." Mr. Elby chose a spot by the wall and leaned with the respectful distance of a man who knows glass can remember fingerprints. He looked toward the drawers and nodded once, as if answering a question asked without sound. "He counts what people were waiting for," he said. "Letters, wires, parcels, calls that didn't arrive. Sometimes we had to be the exchange ourselves." "What happens when the counting ends?" I asked softly to keep the room from bristling. "The shape remains." He answered with the quiet certainty of someone who has mown grass around too many truths to count. "That's enough for most things." The tapping passed down the wall and paused at drawer 72. The wood accepted the touch as if wood and ferrule had shaken hands before. 1, 2, 3. I stepped closer and saw, tucked under the drawer's rim, a very old ticket stub, softened to cloth by many years, stamped with the ghost of a destination. Low. I left it where it lived. Some things are complete simply by being found again. The bell made the faintest complaint at its own weight and then forgave itself. On the counter, under the map's brass paperweight, an envelope had appeared that had not been there a moment before. Its paper was the thick kind that likes to keep its corners. No stamp, no address, only a pressed circle in the flap where a seal once lived. I did not open it. I knew with the sort of knowing that keeps you from sleep when you forget it, that the envelope was not for me. "I'll see it along," Mr. Elby said as if I'd asked. "That's part of my walking too." We stood in the small light and practiced the art of not asking what we both already knew. After he left, the exchange stayed awake with me. I sat on the customer stool and looked at the narrow window over the counter, where a slice of night had learned to wait. The telegraph key never moved, but the space around it grew companionable the way rooms do after the second cup of tea. I read backward in the journal. Entries came sparse, then thick. March 1969. He tapped the counter and I thought of all the missed names. July 1972. Do not answer a door that offers you someone else's message. October 1981. A man joked about a direct line to Greyford. We laughed. After, we wrote his name on the slate because no one knew where to send his letters. My eyes blurred at the edges, the way print softens when the body remembers sleep. I let them. Outside, a car slowed and passed without having existed. Somewhere in the hills, a fox reconsidered the ditch and chose the hedge. From the drawers, 1, 2, 3, a sequence that made me breathe to its shape. I closed the journal and rested my hand on its cover. Through the leather, a warmth met my palm. Not heat, exactly, but the presence of recent thought. I paired my name with the buildings in the quiet style I had learned. At the exchange, I murmured. I am inside. The light agreed by staying pale. I must have dozed the way one dozes in a good chair, half sitting on the hour's lap. When I lifted my head, the bell's shadow had moved a little across the counter. The pocket watch offered one patient tick and settled back into its ever margin. On the slate, a new line had been added to the list of names. Not my own, not anyone I knew, a tidy hand that belonged to no present person. Under it, a faint chalk mark crossed the divide to the other column where Tally, Morley, Price keep company. It looked less like a ledger and more like a bridge nobody would step on and everyone would still use. It was time to leave. The exchange has always known when to usher without ushering. I placed the small brass key back on the map's corner and slid the journal against the envelope as if to keep it from feeling alone. The bell stayed quiet, the sound of gratitude. At the door, I paused. The hedges listened the way they do when day nurses a decision. The gravel underfoot did its tidy crunch, no louder than it needed. I did knock the exchange. You cannot lock a building that belongs to between times. Outside, the still weather evening had taken on that particular shine that arrives when movement thinks about returning. A ribbon hung from a nearby gate, tied for decoration and not request. Far off, the harbour bells practised their throats. The road to Greyford curved, as if remembering something pleasant. I walked home with the slow certainty of someone who has allowed a room to keep its secrets and been thanked for it anyway. At my table, I set a tourist map beneath the chipped dish and placed my own small brass key on it so the paper would rest. I added a pencil rectangle in the corner where the exchange sits, not accurate, just true, and wrote in small letters, "Not this door." Then, because I had come to care for the ritual, I said aloud for the walls and the night and the part of me that listens, the weather hasn't changed in weeks. It will in the morning. I slept with that in my mouth like a word that holds the blanket still. When change came, it was not dramatic. The tide remembered its cues. The hedges loosened their shoulders. The bell in the exchange might have rung for someone else. I don't know. That is not my door. That is not my envelope. My work is to stay inside the name that fits and answer only the knocks that belong to my wood. Sometimes on evenings when the air grows thick again and the road loses its polish, I take the long curve by the hills and glance at the shutter slats. A low glow will be waiting there, the kind that makes paper keep its corners. Not an invitation, but an acknowledgement, like the beam that chooses not to leave the glass at Bracken Point. If I keep walking, I might hear 3 measured taps drift through the hedges. They will not be for me. I let the ground count because it knows how. I keep my hands where my house can see them. I carry a pocket watch that does not run because it understands the shape of patience. I let the key weigh the map. Everything is exchanged eventually. The message arrives even if what comes is only shape, only stillness, only the kindness of a room that remembers you when you open the door. Some nights after my visit to the exchange, I caught myself listening for its bell from my own doorway. Pause. It's not that I expected to hear it. Sound doesn't travel that far in Greyford, and besides, the bell there is the sort that rings for the room it lives in, not for the street outside. But still, on certain evenings when the air thickened, I'd think I caught the faintest suggestion of a chime. Not enough to startle. Just enough to let the quiet know it wasn't alone. I began walking home from the hills more often, taking the curve that passes the exchange. Most nights it sat in its usual silence, hedges leaning as they always do, gravel crunching in its careful way. The shutters never moved. Then, one late afternoon in October, I saw a sliver of light through the upper corner of a shutter. It wasn't bright, more like the pale bloom of a lamp turned low. I slowed my steps without thinking. Something was resting against the door again. Not the journal this time, but a small envelope, its flap held shut with a pressed circle where wax had once been. No name, no address. I didn't pick it up. Instead, I stood there long enough for the air to acknowledge me. a slow, even recognition, like the way a tide moves up the pilings without changing the sound it makes. The envelope disappeared a week later. I hadn't seen anyone take it. The next time the light showed, I stepped closer to the shutters. The room beyond looked much as I'd left it. Pigeonhole drawers in their orderly rows, the counter with its quiet bell, the map still spread with the brass key holding its corner. Only one thing had changed. On the slate behind the counter, where the names were listed, someone had drawn a thin chalk line from the column of the known, Tally, Morley, Price, to a single name on the other side, mine. The line didn't join them directly. It curved, bending as if to avoid something invisible between. It felt less like a connection and more like a path no one wanted to walk. I stayed there a while, watching the dust drift in the low light. A soft sound came from inside. 3 taps, evenly spaced from somewhere among the drawers. I didn't answer. That wasn't my knock. When I finally turned to go, I noticed something on the step. A thin strip of paper with a number stamped in faded ink. 72. It was the same drawer I'd seen tapped before. The paper felt softer than it should have, like it had been folded and unfolded too many times. On the back, someone had written in pencil, "Not this door." At home, I slid the strip under the chipped dish with my key and folded map. The weight of the brass kept it flat. When I looked at it in the morning, it seemed to have darkened slightly, as though it had been thinking overnight. I didn't go back to the exchange for a long time after that. Some doors, even the ones you've already stepped through, are best left to count without you for a while. The weather hasn't changed in weeks. It will. In the morning. Story 7. Under Greyford's town hall, there is a room that was not on any plan I could find. If you asked for a map, the clerk would slide you a neat foldout with cheerful icons, lighthouse, market, harbour, and if you asked for the basement, you would be told there was a boiler, a cupboard of chairs, and a smell of old paint. But there is also a door, low, unnumbered, painted the colour of plaster so your eye will forget it, and on evenings when the air goes still and the tide can't make up its mind, the paint looks a shade thinner, as if the wall has been thinking. I first noticed it after a long day in the records office. The weather hadn't changed in weeks. The town felt folded. I was carrying the small black leather-bound journal in my pocket for no sensible reason. Habit, perhaps, or the comfort of a weight that knew me. When my hand brushed the seam of that unnumbered door, the journal warmed, not hot, just companionable. The latch turned with a shy click. Inside, a narrow stair sank into a coolness that belonged to places with no windows. I went down carefully, counting in my head and then not counting at all. At the bottom waited a room that was mostly table. Not one table, many pushed together so that maps could rest without their edges hanging. The air smelled like clean paper and a little like rain. On the nearest table lay a county map larger than any I'd seen, not printed, inked by hand, a steady pen, a patient wrist. The coastline was a curve I knew well, the harbour tucked under it like a secret that enjoys being told slowly. The river bent exactly as it does at the house by the bend. The lighthouse at Bracken Point leaned discreetly in the drawn light. Pinned at the corners with smooth river stones, the map breathed. Not up and down, exactly. More the way a sheet breathes when someone sleeping turns without waking. Beside it lay a small brass key the size of my thumbnail. On its bow, faint as a thought, Greyford. I set the journal beside the key and leaned my palms on the wood so the room could see them. Evening, I said, because manners have kept me safe in stranger places. From the far end of the tables, between 2 rolled charts tied with blue tape, came a sound I know too well to mistake. 1 tap, 2, 3, measured, kindly spaced, as if asking the room if it was ready to be counted. I didn't look right away. This is how I have learned to be welcomed, by letting a place finish introducing itself. When I did lift my head, I saw no one, but I felt the presence a walking stick's ferrule makes when it rests lightly on wood that has held up many decisions. The journal opened by itself, a gentle fan of paper. On a fresh page in that narrow, deliberate hand that has accompanied so many of my evenings, a single line wrote itself: "Stand where the map does not reach." The words sat in the middle of the page with the confidence of objects that have lived elsewhere and know how to behave in any room. I moved around the table. At the south edge of the map, just beyond the lighthouse, a pale border ran, not an inked line, not blank, more a lack of line, like a shoreline the room had chosen not to finish drawing. The space was the width of a breath. I stood there, heels on the drawn causeway, toes in the quiet margin, and felt a small adjustment in my chest, as if a watch had been wound one turn and then set on the table to be beautiful. The ferrule touched the table near my knee. Not a knock this time. A press and a release, a circle made in air and taken back. I inclined my head without meaning to, the way you do when a person older than anyone is being precise near you. "Not this door," I said softly to the unnumbered stair behind me, because saying it has become a way to stay myself. On the far wall, a tall cabinet kept shallow drawers with brass pulls. They had that museum quiet, not silence, readiness. Each pull was labelled in a tidy hand: tide profiles, parish lines, 1972 still weather, beam sweep, exchange pigeonholes. A modest label near the bottom read simply, "Names." I slid the names drawer open with the care of moving a sleeping cat. Inside lay cards, each the colour of old tea, each ruled lightly to guide a hand that did not wish to slope. No index, no order I could catch at first look, but after a moment the visible names arranged themselves in a way that made the hairs on my arms raise, not alphabetical, not by date, by patience. Tolly, Morley, Price, others I knew only because rooms had introduced us. And there among them, my name in a hand that has never met me, written as if it belonged on a map that waits. I closed the drawer gently, not to hide the sight, but to let the cards keep their calm. The room brightened without gaining light. On the main table, the large map shifted its emphasis by a degree. Streets fattened, a pier's posts drew tiny shadows, a chalk line appeared faintly down the spine of the town, like a seam a tailor would respect. At a corner, a pencil had sketched a little square where the exchange sits, labelled small, not this door. In the river bend, a small circle hovered just off the bank, an absence that meant whole. The lighthouse's lens, drawn in miniature, carried a belt of pale that chose to remain indoors. The pocket of my coat grew heavier. I reached in and found, not my own watch, a very thin oval, warm from being somewhere it preferred. Its hands rested together at the margin, content. I set it by the brass key. The two pieces of weight considered one another and became friends in the old-fashioned way, without speaking. The journal wrote again. "The weather hasn't changed in weeks." Then, in the municipal hand that always arrives to turn testimony into a file, "Basement map room unlisted. Access during still weather intervals. Advise remain. If map completes itself while occupied, do not step off the drawn floor." I looked down. The flagstones under the table had acquired a faint grid, not painted, not chalked, as though someone had laid a very large piece of paper over the room, and the paper had decided to be stone. Each square was the size of a careful step. The square beneath my shoes felt exactly right for me. From the stair faint, the kind of sound wood makes when it chooses to cool. 1, 2, 3. I didn't answer. That knock was for the door that pretends to be part of the wall. This room, this map, was already answering the thing that counted. A side table held a drawer with no label. Its pull was plain. When I slid it open, I found a small pressed sprig of blossoms under glass and, beside it, a ribbon tied without urgency in harbour colours. A note beneath, in a hand I could picture, "All the same patience." I thought of Mr. Elby and felt the strange domestic hopefulness that arrives when a place recognises your friends. The map rippled, the quietest motion, and then stilled. A new line had drawn itself at the edge of town, a path thin as a hair that led from the churchyard gate to the river bend and then continued in a dotted manner across the water. Someone had penciled beside it, "For when counting ends." I placed my palm on the coast, just below Greyford's name. The paper was cool. The line of shore steadied under my hand like a horse that has decided to trust the rein. I felt the ferrule touch the table once more, directly opposite where my palm lay, and in that symmetry I found a strange relief, like when two clocks in a house forget to disagree. The watch ticked once. The key didn't move. The journal waited. "All right," I whispered, not to anyone in particular. "All right." I wrote in the journal in my own hand. Plain letters, no flourishes. I stayed inside. I did not step off the drawn floor. If a map completes itself in the night, it is because morning needs to know where to begin. The room approved by letting me hear how quiet it had always been. I came back the next evening and the next. A map room asks for many small visits rather than a long, intrusive one. Sometimes the large chart showed a faint beam drawn inside the lighthouse lens. Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes the exchange's shutter was a pencil hatch. Sometimes the line simply suggested. At the river bend, the circle of knot mark grew a little kinder in its emptiness. The pier's far post kept its 3 small dents. The chalk line down the town's main street faded and darkened with the room's patient weather. Once I found a folded ticket stub tucked under the brass key. It had no station name left upon it, only the word low and a crease that implied many decisions. I set it in the names drawer between Morley and Price without choosing why, and the cards accepted the addition the way shelves accept more books when a house grows up. Another time, the unnumbered door above me made a sound, not a knock. A settling. The kind a house makes when the late bus sighs past and the walls tell each other it will be fine. I pressed my thumb to the map where Greyford's letters nestle along the shore and said both names together softly, mine and the town's. It felt like sleeping in a bed that keeps your shape in the mattress without trapping you. On a night that smelled like a kettle deciding not to boil, the ferrule tap came early. 1, 2, 3. It travelled the length of the table, pausing above certain places, the lighthouse, the exchange, the cemetery tree, and then drew near the margin where my toes once stood. I did not step forward. I didn't need to. The circle pressed and lifted, and I understood that someone had measured something so I wouldn't have to. The journal turned a page and offered me a sentence written long ago, dated October 1972. When the beam swept the room, it stayed inside the glass. Another dated February 2007, a person returned who had not been gone in the way people mean. And then undated, in a hand like the sea made into letters, the weather hasn't changed in weeks. I closed the book with the gentleness you give to a sleeper who will wake happy if not jarred. I set the key on top and let its small, earned weight keep the page I'd written from floating up. The map smoothed itself. Lines the width of a breath promised to stay for as long as they were needed and to go without argument when rain decided to be helpful. I stood where the floor had drawn a square for me and felt what I have learned to call rest. Not the absence of questions, the presence of answers that don't require noise. "Good night," I said to the room, to the unnumbered stare, to the map that knew to leave blanks. The ferrule replied once, like a pen lifting at the end of a sentence. I climbed back through the door that pretends not to be a door and let it find its paint again. Up in the hall, the clock made the sound of a patient machine being correct. Mrs. Bell would be closing her shutters. Somewhere, Father Hal would be winding a watch because the feel of it is dear. At the harbour, a ribbon on a door would lift an inch, then decide to hang modestly. At the river bend, the porch would know the weight of a key on a folded map. The lighthouse at Bracken Point would lean toward the water with the affection of a keeper who will never stop looking. Out in the street, I said the words that helped the night lie flat. The weather hasn't changed in weeks. It will in the morning. And then I went home by the long way, hands where my house could see them, name paired kindly with the place that keeps it, letting the ground do any counting that needed doing. It was a week before I returned to the map room. Not because I had forgotten it. You don't forget a place that draws its own coastlines, but because I've learned that some rooms want to breathe between visits. If you step in too often, You risk seeing it as only a room, instead of what it really is, a conversation you're allowed to join only when the air is in the right mood. The weather still hadn't changed in weeks. Greyford sat in that particular stillness it gets in the long intervals, as if the whole town were waiting for something, and had been for years. When I reached the town hall, the unnumbered door looked just as it had before, painted the colour of "Don't Notice Me." But I could feel the cool draught along the wall where it met the floor. The journal in my pocket gave the slightest bend, like a cat arching its back in recognition. The stair to the basement felt steeper than I remembered. The coolness gathered around my ankles and stayed there, not unpleasant, the kind of cool you find inside stone on a summer's day. At the bottom, the map waited. Its paper edges were a little curled this time, as though it had been listening closely to something and wanted to lean in. The brass key sat in its place on the corner, but the small watch was gone. In its place, a slip of paper folded into thirds. I opened it and read the neat, narrow hand. He measured the margins. Leave them. The southern coast was the same, but the inland was different. Pencil lines had grown from the river toward the hills, thin threads that stopped in mid-air, ending not with a point, but with a pause. One dotted line stretched out past Bracken Point and ended in the middle of the drawn sea. The journal lay closed in the centre of the table. I reached to open it and paused. From somewhere under the tables came the sound. 1, 2, 3. Measured, patient, familiar. This time the ferrule didn't lift right away. It lingered on the third tap, the way a pen sometimes rests on paper before finishing the curve of a letter. When it did move, a single petal, white, small, out of season, slid from under the table's edge. It drifted across the map, over the chalk line through Greyford's main street, and came to rest on the pier's far post. I opened the journal. The page was new. In the same narrow hand it read, "If you find a blossom on the drawn wood, let it stay there until the tide moves." Beneath it, in the hurried, darker script that always feels like an interruption, "Do not brush away what arrived unasked." I left the petal where it lay. The paper of the map didn't seem to mind its weight. It sat lightly on the pier's post, as if it had been there forever. From the stairs came the sound of a footstep that wasn't one, more a suggestion of someone choosing not to enter. I didn't turn. Instead, I rested my palm on the map where the river's bend curled, and I said softly, "This is the door that stays shut." The ferrule touched the table once more, this time on the lighthouse's drawn gallery, and lifted without marking. The circle pressed and taken back. Whole, nothing, both. I stayed until the petals settled flat and the air in the room relaxed like a breath finally let out. Then I closed the journal, set the brass key on top, and stepped back onto the square the floor had drawn for me. The stair greeted me without sound. Up in the hall, the clerk was stamping papers with the calm of someone who had never been below. She glanced up as I passed and said, "Still warm for the season?" "Yes," I answered. "The weather hasn't changed in weeks." Outside, the town's quiet was almost companionable. The harbour's ropes hung slacks, the ribbons on certain doors shifting just enough to remember they were tied there. I walked home by the long way, my hands where my house could see them, letting the ground do any counting that might still need doing. It was 3 nights later when the map began to finish its own sentences. I felt it before I saw it, a hush that settled lower in the room, as if the tables themselves had exhaled and were waiting to hear what they'd written. The unnumbered door admitted me without asking. I took the stairs slowly, one careful step per breath, and kept my hand along the cool wall so the room could feel where I was. Down in the light that isn't light, the great paper coast lay almost as I'd left it, the brass key on the corner, the blossom, pressed flat now, resting on the drawn pier's far post, a thin dotted line wandering into the sea and stopping at a pause instead of a point. Only one thing had changed. The faint grid on the floor had extended 3 squares deeper under the tables. The new squares glowed a little in the way chalk glows when the late sun remembers it. I stood where my square used to be and didn't move. The journal lay closed in the centre, the ribbon tucked under as if not to make a scene. Somewhere near the cabinet of drawers, a sound located itself delicately. 1, 2, 3. It walked, the way tapping can walk when a feral knows the measure of wood. The room accepted it as a familiar guest. On the map, the chalk line down Greyford's main street had softened to a friendly seam, less instruction than memory. At the river bend, the little circle of unmarked had grown faintly brighter, emptiness with intention. The lighthouse lens carried a suggestion of belt light that had decided again to remain indoors. I touched the journal. It warmed under my palm, a teacup sort of warmth, made for hands. I opened to the ribbon and found a line waiting in the narrow, deliberate hand. If the floor draws you forward, let your name step first. I said my name quietly. Then the towns, Greyford, together, not loudly. More the way a person pairs spoon and saucer. The new square received my foot as if it had been drawn around it on purpose. Beyond the main table, the low cabinet labelled names waited in its museum quiet. I slid the drawer a finger's width. The cards were exactly as before, no index, no visible order, yet the topmost had altered its patience. I could feel the attention of the room leaning toward them. "Evening," I said, because rooms listen best to good manners. "I will not disturb what knows how to rest." From underneath the tables, 1, 2, 3. The third lingered a heartbeat, as though to underline a sentence we were all about to read together. The ferrule then lifted without scrape, the circle pressed and taken back, a hold that refused to be punctuation. A soft slip of air crossed the map. Not draft, consent. A faint pencil thread began to unspool at the edge of the harbour, tracing the shape of the causeway to Bracken Point with impossible tenderness. The line paused at the lighthouse gallery, made the smallest loop, the memory of a lamp, perhaps, and returned landward by a path that had never existed on any county survey. I stood still, letting the room draw. The watch was back, though I hadn't brought it, thin oval, hands resting together at the margin as if they had politely excused themselves from minutes. It sat beside the brass key like a conversation that knew when to be quiet. I set my fingers lightly on both, and the map brightened another degree, enough to show a thing I had hoped not to see, and was relieved to finally name. A second unnumbered door, sketched faintly beneath the church, in the place where the stones warm slower than the day. The journal turned its own page. "Do not open what is already answering." Beneath, in the municipal hand, "Advise, remain on drawn floor if margins begin to close." I looked, really looked, at the southern rim where the paper had always chosen blank. The margin had not closed. It had learned a new sort of leaving alone. The line wasn't a line. It was the outline of a pause. Enough room for a foot if a foot could be air. From the stairwell, a small sound like a coat settling on a peg. I didn't turn. When I do not look, I see more kindly. The ferrule touched a place just left of the exchange and lifted. The bell there, remembered through wood and paper, chimed once in the room's mind and made no noise at all. Drawer 72, wherever it lives, accepted a tap that arrived here. I felt the floor under me answer back, a quiet, assuring weight the size of my own. Not this door, I told the map's fainted sketch under the church, the river bend, the pier and the causeway at once. Not tonight. Then, because it helps me sleep, I added, "We will let the ground do any counting." I waited. The room agreed by doing exactly what it had already been doing. A petal that wasn't there drifted down from the underside of the table and came to rest on the lighthouse's loop. It looked right, like a light keeping houseplants in winter. The journal wrote one more line in the narrow hand. "When the map completes itself, it is only reminding you where to remain." I exhaled through my nose, slow, as if the paper could feel the kindness of the breath. For a long while nothing moved, which is the best kind of movement in Greyford. Then the chalk grid on the floor drew a final square around my shoes and stopped, satisfied with the shape of me. The dotted line that wandered into the sea found a harbour it had not drawn before, a small oval of safe water far offshore, labelled in print so tiny even the room had to lean to read. "Low." "Of course," I whispered. "Of course." The watch ticked once, content, not corrective. The key did its only job, which is to weigh what must not blow away. The blossom on the pier's post pressed flatter, the way a yes makes itself modest. From the table's plank joints, 1, 2, 3. And then a fourth sound that was not a knock, not even a settling, more like paper taken gently by two hands that love it. I placed my palm on the map where the town's name curls its F into the shore. I paired my name with it again, smaller now. I am inside. The room loosened its shoulders. I closed the journal, set the key upon it, and lifted the watch to my ear, not to listen for time, only to hear the permission of its quiet. It felt like a pocket-sized lighthouse with its beam kept tastefully within the glass. "I will go," I said to the unnumbered door, "and I will come back, but not so soon that you have to become only a room." The ferrule answered once on the wood, a polite tap that could have been a bow, and withdrew into whatever corridor touches all our corridors when the weather thinks too long. I backed off the drawn square and let the chalk fade behind my heels. On the stairs, the cool rose with me in the careful way of cellars and undertakings. Up in the hall, the clock on the wall kept the town's version of accurate. The clerk stamped papers like blessings. I nodded, she nodded. That was plenty. Outside, the harbour ropes had not tightened yet, but the gulls had flown a little higher. A ribbon on a door lifted its tail and remembered it was decoration first. The river practiced a wrinkle. At my own threshold, I set the tourist map under the chipped dish and placed my small brass key on it. Not for need, just for rightness. I added a pencil dot at the town hall and wrote in letters so tiny I had to smile at myself. Door that forgets it's a door. Then I drew a hair-thin curve from the river bend to the exchange, to the lighthouse, to the pier's far post, stopping before each as if to bow. I stood in my kitchen without turning on a light. I said the words that smooth the night's fabric. The weather hasn't changed in weeks. Then, in the same breath, like tucking in the corner of a blanket, it will in the morning. I slept with my hands where my house could see them, the ground counting whatever was left to count, the map finishing itself kindly in the dark, like a letter that knows the address by heart. The next time I went back to the town hall, the unnumbered door was harder to find. Not because it had moved, but because the paint had learned to be the exact colour of the wall again, the seam showing itself only in the way light bends when it decides to keep a secret. I might not have seen it at all if the journal in my coat hadn't given a faint, friendly thump against my ribs as I walked past. The latch turned with that same shy click, like a person leaning in to tell you something and then remembering they don't need to say it. The stairs smelled of cool paper and stone. I counted them without meaning to, then stopped at 3, old habit. The room was as I'd left it, map spread and pinned under river stones, brass key holding one corner, the pressed blossom still resting on the pier's far post. But there were changes. A new dotted line had appeared, so faint I had to lean close, starting at the cemetery's unmarked tree and curving inland toward the hills. It ended in a small circle drawn in the same pale pencil as the margins, and there was something on my square of floor, a folded scrap of paper weighted by the watch. I unfolded it. The narrow, deliberate hand read, "If the map shows a circle away from the water, stand there with your name. The ground will decide what to keep." I slipped the note into the journal and looked at the circle. It was small, no bigger than the base of a walking stick, the kind of mark that isn't a place until someone stands in it. The ferrule touched wood under the table. 1, 2, 3. I moved around to the inland edge of the map. The circle waited, patient as a cup set out for a guest who hasn't knocked yet. I placed my finger on it and said both names, mine and Greyford's. The paper seemed to settle under my touch, not flattening, more like breathing out. The journal opened itself. A fresh line appeared in darker, quicker script. "Circle is whole. Do not widen it." Another in the tidy municipal hand followed beneath. "Location not previously marked. Likely temporary. Observe without entry." The watch gave one quiet tick. The brass key stayed still. From somewhere near the drawers of names, a fourth sound almost arrived and then stopped. I felt it in my chest the way you feel someone about to speak and then choose not to. I stayed in my square until the circle on the map faded back to margin. When I climbed the stairs, the hall felt a little warmer. Outside, the harbour ropes were drawn just tight enough to hum in the slight air. The ribbons on the doors hung still, but they looked as though they might stir soon. I walked home the long way, thinking about that inland circle, a place the map knew for only an afternoon, and that I might never see with my eyes. It felt right, somehow, that some parts of Greyford remain drawn only in rooms that don't always want to be found. At my door, I set the journal on the table with the brass key resting on top. The watch stayed in my palm for a moment longer before I placed it down. It was still, but I thought I felt a faint warmth in its quiet. I said the words for the room, for myself, and for the map folded somewhere deeper than paper. The weather hasn't changed in weeks. It will in the morning. It was the kind of evening when the town forgets to blink. The harbour wore its ropes like quiet sentences. The gulls stitched low seams over water that hadn't made up its mind. I walked to the town hall because my hands needed a place to rest, and the map room has a way of holding them without taking them away from me. The unnumbered door found its colour again only when my shoulder brushed its seam. The latch made that small, shy sound. I went down, counting the first 3 steps the way a person hums the first 3 notes of a lullaby and then lets the song finish itself. Below, the air held paper and stone and a little rain that belonged to other nights. The map breathed, the way bedclothes do when someone asleep turns and remembers a kinder dream. The brass key waited in its corner. The pressed blossom, paler now, still rested on the pier's far post. The watch lay with its hands at the margin, excused from minutes. But the floor had changed. The faint chalk grid extended again, not wide. Never wide, only 1 square forward, 1 to the left, like the town politely scooting its chair to make room for me. And something new sat on the edge nearest the cabinet of drawers, a small, folded card, weighted by a river stone smooth as a thought. I lifted the stone and read the card. The narrow, deliberate hand, if the margins begin to close, remain where the map decides you belong. Beneath, in the municipal hand, advise doors shut, eyes down, count if you must, but not for long. I set the card under the stone again, like tucking a child back into bed. I stepped onto my square, said my name paired with Greyford in the quiet way that makes rooms breathe easier, and watched the coast. From under the table, 1, 2, 3, the ferrule touched wood and lifted. It paused near the exchange, hovered over drawer 72 as if wood remembers where it was knocked last week, then travelled toward the inland hills, the very direction that faint circle had sketched, and then withdrawn. The map brightened a hair's breadth. New pencil threads grew from the river, thin, dotted, undecided lines, fanning toward the slope where the town's road gives up its paving. They stopped at pauses instead of points, as if the room had learned that ending gently leaves fewer questions. I opened the names drawer a finger's width. Cards rested the way old cats do, not sleeping, not awake, wise about both. The top card now bore a pressed petal tucked into its upper corner, a pale thumbprint of the cemetery tree's out-of-season bloom. 3 names shared that card: Tally, Morley, Price, and a faint 4th ghosted below them, not inked, only suggested by the paper fibres having once endured weight. I slid the drawer shut with my palm flat so the cabinet would feel respected. The journal warmed under my hand. When I opened it, a line had already begun to write itself. The weather hasn't changed in weeks. Another line followed. My hand this time. I stayed inside. Then a third, arriving as if a person I trusted had leaned near my shoulder. If the room finishes its map, let it. You are not asked to leave, not yet. The ferrule touched again. Tap, 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 and then lingered in the space the tapping left, the way ink darkens in the centre of a letter when a pen thinks about lifting. The chalk grid tugged 1 square forward under my shoes. I did not step. I said, "Not this door," to the floor, to the unnumbered stair, to the lighthouse drawn in miniature, to the exchange's shutter hatches, to the river's circle of whole emptiness, to the pier's far post and the blossom that kept it company. Somewhere above, in the life of the town that prefers to keep its privacy, a clock reset itself without anybody touching it. The room heard the news and decided not to comment. I stood long enough for my body to forget it was standing. The air grew denser, then lighter, the way wool turns to cotton when your skin thinks a friend's hand is near. And that was when the closing started. Not the margins, exactly, but the spaces between lines. Streets thickened by a whisper. The chalk seam down the main road softened from instruction to story. The dotted path that had ventured into the sea found a narrow oval of safety labelled low and circled it once for luck. The watch ticked once. The key did its small, faithful job. The journal waited with the patience of wood. I picked up the watch and held it to my ear. There is no sound more like consent than a stopped watch that occasionally remembers you. I set it down and turned my palm over so the map could read my hand for itself. Something happened then that I could only have called a hush, even if I'd had better words. The ferrule pressed, lightly, like a pen that means not to mark, and drew a circle at the edge of the cemetery where a route runs under the path. The line did not darken the paper. It changed the room, the way a person who says your name with forgiveness changes a kitchen. Another heavy, soft breath passed through the tables. On the map, the lighthouse lens received a band of light that elected, once again, to stay inside the glass. The exchange's shutters got a little more slat. The bell there held its note by refusing to ring. Drawer 72, wherever it lives, felt satisfied. When the fourth sound came, it was not a knock. It was a settling, exactly on the square beneath my shoes, the square the room had drawn for me. My chest answered by letting go of a small, old thread of worry I hadn't realized I'd been holding, and the room accepted the gift as if it had been expecting it. I wrote in the journal in the plainest hand I own, "When the map closes, it is closing around you, not on you." Then smaller, as if I were explaining it to myself for sleep. Remain. Count nothing. The ground does it more kindly. I closed the book, and because it has become a habit I care for, I set the brass key on top to keep the page from rising. The watch lay beside it like a cousin who enjoys the same weather. From the staircase, cloth on wood, perhaps the idea of a coat, perhaps a person who had been careful for so long the carefulness learned to walk alone, came a courteous pause. I didn't turn. When I don't look, I see better. "Evening," I said to the pause, for the sake of politeness, and because the room likes to be treated like a person when it's working. The pause answered by not going away. That, too, is an answer. I left when the chalk grid stopped extending, when the paper's edges drew their breath back in and lay flat, when the ferrule's patience turned from counting to companionship. I climbed and came up through the door that forgets it's a door, and stood in the hall a long minute, because halls sometimes need their share of attention. Outside, Greyford held its posture. Ribbons kept their relaxed tails. The harbour ropes had drawn the smallest hum into themselves. The wind wasn't wind. It was the permission of leaves to be heard again. The weather hadn't changed in weeks, and yet, if you put your palm to a stone wall and waited, you could feel the story loosening its shoulders. I went home the way a person who has been carefully named goes home. At my table, I set the tourist map beneath the chipped dish and laid the little brass key upon it, not because paper needs weighing in still weather, but because I like the way that weight feels like yes. I sketched a hair-thin line from the town hall to the cemetery tree to the hills, and ended it where a pause would be. I wrote in letters small enough to keep the room asleep, for when counting ends. I left the lamp unlit and listened to the house make the noises it makes when it remembers being built by hands that liked their work. I said, the weather hasn't changed in weeks for the sake of ritual. Then in the margin of the sentence I added, it will in the morning. The map room let a week pass without me, which is to say I let the map room decide what a week meant. When I returned, the door was harder to see and easier to open. That is how certain friendships go. The stairs held their cool. The paper held its coast. The blossom, flatter now, almost part of the sheet, remained on the pier's post like a promise you don't need to speak again to keep. Something new had taken a place on the table's far corner. An envelope of heavy paper, unaddressed, sealed once and then unsealed, its flap closed by the weight of a pocket watch set upon it. I did not open the envelope. It was not for me. I knew that certainty the way you know which knock belongs to your wood. In the journal, a line waited in that friendly, busy script, "Do not carry what is already on its way." Beneath it, in the tidy hand that lives for files but loves gentleness more, "Exchange to handle." I smiled, thinking of the hedges leaning and the bell that likes to ring only for the room. I slid the envelope to the corner where the river stones pin the map, set the watch back in its old patience, and pressed a fingertip to the coast just below the letter F in Greyford. The paper steadied like a person being told their name kindly after forgetting it for a moment. The ferrule touched wood 3 times, 1, 2, 3, near my square. I answered by not answering, by staying put, by letting the ground do the rest. The map brightened that hair's breadth again, showing me nothing new and everything I needed. A town that knows how to remain, a pier that knows how to be the farthest post, a river bend that knows when a circle must mean whole, a lens that keeps its beam modestly within the glass, a room that draws its own floors so our feet can remember where they are. I said good night to each without saying a word. The door that forgets it's a door, remembered to be one for me, and then forgot again, which is the idea. Back outside, the air had practiced a tiny ripple. Somewhere a kettle decided to boil after weeks of thinking it over. A ribbon lifted itself into agreement with a breeze that had not yet arrived. The tide looked at its work and resumed it without fanfare. At my own threshold, I set the key on the map and paired my name with the house one last time. I stood with my hands where the house could see them. I listened for counting and heard only rest. The weather hasn't changed in weeks. I said softly, because endings are better when they sound like the beginning you loved. It will, in the morning. The ground, which keeps our best ledgers, said nothing at all, which is how you know the account is in balance. Story 8. At the northern edge of Greyford, just before the road disappears into heath and wind, there's an old signal house that hasn't worked in decades. Its square tower leans slightly toward the coast, its weathered shutters drawn half-closed, as if the building is watching the sea with one cautious eye. Most people pass it without stopping. The lane is narrow there and the hedgerows grow thick, their roots holding the earth together the way a knot holds a net. But on still weather evenings, when the gulls circle low and the air feels both heavy and expectant, a pale light sometimes moves behind the tower's shutters. Not bright, just enough to make you think of lamps that burn for company rather than for sight. I had seen that light from a distance before, but never gone close. One late afternoon, though, as the sun gave up trying to break through the clouds, I found myself at the base of the lane, with no reason not to. The grass along the path had been pressed down recently, as if someone had walked there with slow, deliberate steps. The air smelled faintly of oil, not fresh oil, but the kind that lingers in timbers after years of turning gears. The door at the base of the tower was unlocked. Inside, the air was cool, and held a quiet that seemed practiced. A narrow desk stood against the wall, and on it lay a small black leather-bound journal. The word Greyford was pressed faintly into the cover. I stood a moment with my hand on the doorframe, feeling the grain of old paint under my fingertips. The room had that careful quiet of places that remember being useful. A set of brass levers sat in a row beneath the window, each capped with a cracked porcelain label. Upline, downline, distant, home. Their surfaces were clean in the pattern a rag leaves when it visits out of affection rather than duty. I set the journal on the desk and let my palm rest on its cover. The leather gave a little, warm as a coat that has learned your shape. The faint press of Greyford flashed and disappeared as the light outside shifted. Through the window I could see the narrowing lane, the hedges shouldering in, and beyond them a ribbon of heath the colour of old rope. The sea sat beyond all that, a grey plate with no suggestion of edge. The gulls kept low, making the same slow loops as if they were practising a letter together. I opened the journal to the ribbon. The first page held a date, May 11th, 1972. The narrow, deliberate hand wrote, "Signal arms resting, fog under the hill." He walked the outside platform and tapped each post in threes. He paused at the lever marked home. The weather hasn't changed in weeks. I glanced at the lever with that very word printed under the porcelain cap. It sat slightly forward of the others, the small pin that should lock it in place absent. A set of ridged marks, 3 in a neat row, scuffed the brass near its base. So crisp they looked recent. I turned the page. Someone else had written beneath, the municipal hand that makes even warnings look like tidy notes. Power removed, 1969. Reports of lamp at shutter inconsistent. Advise, do not signal into still weather. Remain inside. Count if necessary. 3 only. The tower breathed. One small adjustment in the wood somewhere above, the sound of timbers remembering what the day weighs. From the narrow stair to the upper platform came a sound I've learned to recognize before hearing it. 1 tap, 2, 3. I didn't move right away. I let the room finish telling me its temperature, its patience, its polite expectation that I would behave as a guest behaves. Then I stood, slid the journal into my coat pocket so it could watch, and climbed the stairs, palm trailing the rail so the grain would understand I meant no speed. The upper room was half window, half shadow. The shutters had been drawn to a cautious angle that allowed a long, thin view of the heath and a slice of sea beyond. The signal arm outside, faded red with a white bar, was fixed midway between stop and go, as if it had paused to listen and never been told to stop listening. The tapping came again, nearer now, precise and considerate. 1, 2, 3. It came from the outside platform, the narrow catwalk that circled the tower beneath the arms. I kept my eyes level. I've learned that if I look too directly, Greyford's still weather things grow shy or become too present. Through the shutter slat, in the blur that happens when you refuse to focus, I saw a coat, a brim, the angle of a walking stick eased against the outer rail. He did not knock at the window. He measured, the ferrule touching iron as if the metal were a ledger, and his task a sum he had promised to keep balancing. Evening, I said, because some words steady a place. No answer as usual. Instead, the ferrule lifted the smallest fraction and hovered, a circle made and taken back before it could draw attention to itself. Then the measure moved on along the catwalk, 3 taps at the next post, and the next. On the sill rested a little tin of oil and a cloth folded into a square the size of a palm. I touched neither. The air smelled faintly of old machinery, but not sour, more like cedar, like drawers that have stored clean paper for a long time. Downstairs, the levers settled with a tiny, unanimous sigh. The one marked home leaned forward another breath, as if any lever could think of home as a direction. The lamp behind the shutters, a low, weak thing you could miss if you wanted to, breathed once brighter and then returned to its chosen dimness. I pulled the journal out and let it fall open. A new line had arrived, still wet enough that the ink shone a little. Do not answer into stillness. Not with light, not with code. I ran a finger under the sentence and felt the paper's grain answering under my skin. I did not touch the shutter. I did not touch the lever. I stood very still and counted nothing, letting the ferrule finish what it had come to count. When the tapping stopped, the quiet stayed polite. The low lamp did not pretend to be a signal. The sea held its grey. A gorse bush below the windows made one small motion in the breeze that wasn't yet a breeze. I went back down. On the desk beside the levers, a folded map had appeared without ceremony. County issue, the practical kind, with creases that know their job. In the lower corner, someone had penciled a tiny rectangle where the signal house stands and written, in block letters smaller than you'd think possible, "Not a station." Underneath that, in the municipal hand, cross-ref, Rail file, Greyford, low. And beneath that, in the narrow, deliberate hand, as if to keep the official note company, the weather hasn't changed in weeks. I left the map open so the room could see itself. I set the journal on top of it, the leather warming where the rectangle lay. The home lever's porcelain cap caught the last of the day and made a soft oval glint that seemed more affectionate than mechanical. From somewhere below the floor, close to the foundations where a building's memory lives, a knock arranged itself primly, 3 in a set. I felt it in the soles of my feet, not demand, presence. I laid my palm flat on the desk, and the wood answered with that patient strength tables have when they've held a generation's elbows. Not this door, I said into the quiet, meaning the lane, the shutter, the lever, the temptation to make a sign. Not tonight. The lamp agreed by staying domestic. The tower answered by keeping its shape. The heath accepted a bird settling into gorse the way a shoulder accepts a friend's hand. I wrote a line in the journal in my plainest hand. I stayed inside. Then, under it, smaller, for my own sleep. If a signal house keeps company with the weather, it is not my task to make it speak. I closed the book, and the room relaxed as if I'd folded a blanket with clean corners. On the second evening I brought nothing and found everything in its place. Levers at attention, shutters at their careful angle, the faint lamp inside behaving like a low voice. The journal lay on the desk, though I hadn't left it there. The watch, thin oval there, hands resting together at the margin, sat beside it as if the two had been in conversation. I didn't wind the watch. It wouldn't have liked it. I set a fingertip on its glass, and in that clear, round silence the ferrule touched the outer rail again. 1, 2, 3, this time pausing at the angle where the distant lever's mechanism must once have thrown a signal down the line. A line that no longer exists. A line that perhaps never did in the way maps prefer to show. Has the weather changed? I asked the room, not expecting an answer and receiving the best kind. The lamp held steady, the sea kept its plate, the gulls coiled their thread. The journal turned a page by itself, politely, as if to save me the small effort. The neat hand wrote, "When the lamp is for company only, keep it so. Do not send." Below that, in the municipal hand, advisory confirmed. The home lever leaned forward the smallest shade and then remembered itself. I pressed it back with 2 fingers, not to move the signal, just to remind the brass it wasn't alone in remembering. It settled, mollified, and the pattern of 3 scuffs at its base looked less like a new mark and more like an old lesson. I sat on the stool and watched the window let the day become evening without having to perform. The lane below gathered its narrowness for night. The hedges held their line like stitching that has never come undone. Somewhere a door I know well closed with the sound of someone glad to be inside. A faint scent of rain arrived. Not actual rain, the idea of it. The lamp acknowledged with a tender brightening and then returned to its dim. The ferrule tapped once more on the outer rail, gentler than before. Not counting now, keeping company. It moved away, its patience like the receding tick of a clock that has chosen to stop at the edge of a minute and live there. Before I left, I drew a small rectangle on the tourist map in my pocket where the signal house lives, and wrote in it, "Not a station." Beneath I penciled a line from the lane to the lighthouse, to the river bend, to the exchange, to the cemetery tree, to the town hall's unnumbered door, to platform 7's clock, that narrow route that has, without asking permission, become my way home. Between each I left a little pause and wrote not door and not road, only this, between. I took the long way back. The heath listened, the hedges kept their counsel. The ribbons on those few doors that keep them tied did not flutter. They remembered they could. In my kitchen I set the journal down, then the watch, then my small brass key on top of a folded map that refuses to include any of this, as if by refusing it could keep it safe. I said the words the house leans toward now without being needy. The weather hasn't changed in weeks. It will in the morning. I slept with that in the next room, breathing as if my name and my town had arranged a truce that extends into sleep. Fate. On the third evening, Fog lay low in the cut between the hills, and the lane to the signal house looked like a line a pencil had drawn and then smudged with a thumb. I went anyway, because I have learned that after a place introduces you to itself, the most you can do for it is show up politely when the weather seems shy. Inside, the lamp did not greet me. It regarded me kindly. The levers held their neat positions. The home lever's porcelain cap looked almost like a shell. On the desk, a slip of paper lay beneath the watch. I lifted the watch, its pleasant weight, and read, "If you must speak, signal inward. Pair your name with this room." I set the watch down. I set my palm on the desk. I said my name in a low tone meant for wood and screws and paper. Then I added, "Signal house on the north lane." I didn't say Greyford because that word rides in the air of the place. It knows where it belongs. From outside, the ferrule touched the rail once. Not three. Once. A circle pressed and taken back. The lamp brightened the amount that makes a story continue without requiring a new paragraph. The fog leaned its shoulder against the shutters and rested. I opened the journal and wrote, "I stayed inside." We signalled inward. The weather has not changed. We changed our listening. I closed the book. The room let me go by making no argument. Out on the lane, the fog didn't mind my feet. The hedges made their arch the way altars do when the person walking doesn't need to look up to know they're being kept. A gull turned late above the heath and decided not to speak about it. At home, I set the watch on the map and the key on the watch and the journal on both, and the stack felt like a small, considerate lighthouse that knows better than to sweep the room. Before sleep, I said the words in a whisper for the town that gathers itself when we're kind to it. The weather hasn't changed in weeks. It will in the morning. The ground counted, as it always does, and I did not, which is how I slept. A week passed before I climbed the lane again. The hedges had grown just enough to narrow the path, and the air was holding that deep, quiet weight that Greyford seems to wear in the hours before rain that never quite comes. The signal house leaned in the same way, but the lamp behind the shutters was already glowing, low and steady, like a candle kept for company. The door opened with its usual soft reluctance. Inside, the air felt cooler, and something about it seemed straighter, as though the room had taken a deep breath and decided to stand in perfect balance. On the desk, the black leather journal rested closed, the brass key set on top and the watch beside it, hands still at the margin. But there was something new. A folded square of thick paper tucked under the edge of the key. I slid it free and opened it. The narrow, deliberate hand read, "The weather hasn't changed in weeks. If you hear 1, 2, 3 from the lower stair, do not descend." Beneath, in the municipal hand, possible connection to basement map room. Advise remain at operating level, observe only. I stood still for a moment, letting the paper warm between my fingers. Somewhere deep in the structure, below the timbers, below the room where the levers waited, a sound began. 1, 2, 3. Not heavy knocks, but measured touches, like a careful pen laying points in a line. I set the note back under the key and moved to the window. Outside, the lane was empty. The heath stretched flat, the sea without seam. The gulls were gone. The tapping came again from below. I stayed where I was. The watch gave a single tick, and the lamp brightened a shade, not enough to signal, just enough to say present. I took the journal and opened it. A new line waited. "When he counts below, the ground is not for you." Another in that hurried, darker hand, "Wear your name where you stand." So I did. I spoke my name, paired with signal house on the north lane, and let the desk feel the weight of my palm. The levers sat quietly, each in its resting place. The home lever leaned forward a hair, then drew back on its own. The scuffs at its base looked older now, as though the brass had decided to remember them differently. The tapping below slowed. The room seemed to listen to itself. Then the sound stopped, and the air settled into that comfortable kind of stillness that feels like a blanket pulled to the shoulders. I wrote in the journal. I stayed inside. The count below was not mine. I closed it and set the key back on top, the watch beside it, so they could keep each other company. At the door, I paused to look at the lamp one last time. It held its glow politely, like someone holding the end of a sentence until you've gone far enough not to need the rest. Outside, the lane looked longer, but my walk down it felt shorter. The hedges bent slightly inward, not in warning, in recognition. By the time I reached my own street, the ribbons on certain doors had shifted just enough to catch the corner of the eye, and the harbour ropes were making that small, satisfied hum. I unlocked my door, set the key and watch and journal in their place on the map, and said, for the sake of the walls and the night, the weather hasn't changed in weeks. It will, in the morning. The ground did not disagree. I waited for another week of nothing to become a kind of something. The lane to the signal house taught my feet its old sentences. The hedges practiced their listening. The sea, plate flat, remembered what a seam was and kept it to itself. When I reached the door, the lamp behind the shutters was already low and steady, a quiet held in a glass. The room felt square, balanced. Even the dust was settled as if it had agreed to be part of the furniture. On the desk, the small black leather journal sat with the brass key resting on its cover and the pocket watch beside them, hands together at the margin, abstaining with grace. The porcelain caps of the levers looked like shells on a strand. Upline, downline, distant, home. The home lever leaned the precise fraction allowed for comfort and no more. I stood and let the room make its inventory of me. Then the sound came. Not from the outer rail, from below. 1, 2, 3. A breath. Then a fourth. Not a knock, but a settling, the kind of tone wood makes when a hand decides to rest there. The journal warmed. It opened by itself, a page lifting with the care of a person turning back a coverlet. In the narrow, deliberate hand, if you hear 1, 2, 3 and a settling, pair your name with the stare. Do not rush. Beneath the municipal hand, exception permitted, descend only when the stare draws itself. I let the words sit until the watch gave one polite tick. I moved to the door at the head of the stair and waited, palm on the frame, so the wood could feel my patience the way a horse does. The first 3 steps looked as they always had, worn in the centre, cool along the edges. A fourth seemed to find me rather than appear. Its tread brightened the slightest degree, like chalk remembering the hand that drew it. "I'm inside," I said, my name, and signal house on the north lane. The stair accepted that pairing by not demanding anything else. I went down. Slow, 1 breath per step. The fourth gave a whisper under my shoe, the way paper sighs beneath a pen that doesn't intend to write. The 5th drew itself. The 6th waited, then chose to be. At the turn where the stair hooks around its own shadow, the air smelled faintly of oil that forgot it was oil years ago. The knocks, 1, 2, 3, arrived from a level below me, and the 4th settled like a hand on a rail. I paused at the first landing. There was a door there I had never noticed, because it hadn't needed to be a door yet. A panel the colour of wall, with a seam only light could find. I didn't touch it. The journal made a small weight against my side, like a pocket remembering. The stair kept drawing itself, 1 careful tread at a time. Down again. At the next turning, I found a circle pressed and taken back on the landing centre, not painted, not etched, only the memory of a ring, the size a ferrule would draw if it meant to measure and not to mark. I stood with my toes just touching its edge and spoke both names again. The circle didn't glow. It agreed. Below, the room pressed its quiet up to meet me. I stepped into it without crossing anything that wanted to be a threshold. The sub-basement was more space than room. Brick, timber, and a long trench where cables must once have run, now clean as bone. Along one wall, a chalk plan had been drawn by a steady hand, a side view of the tower, the levers, the arms outside, arrows pointing not out toward lines but inward, toward the room I stood in. Someone had labelled each arrow in tidy script. Home, distant, between. A small square at the bottom read, not a signal. A place to rest. A bench sat against the far wall. On it, a little tin of graphite, an old cloth folded in quarters, and a brass ring that might once have held tags. The ring bore a faint pressed word. Greyford. Of course it did. The world loves a motif if you let it be quiet. From beneath the bench the ferrule touched wood. 1, 2, 3. No fourth this time, not a settling, a listening. "Evening," I said, the way I say in churches and kitchens and doorways I'd rather not test. The ferrule hovered, circle pressed and taken back, and moved along the trench. It tapped the timber cover at equal intervals, kind, exact, the distance 3 boards would be if boards were built by patience. I didn't follow it. I stood near the chalk plan and let my eyes read the titles. Lines, withdrawn, chalked on a shelf above a row of shallow pigeonholes. In 2 of them lay folded paper labels, Low and Home. I didn't unfold them. In a 3rd, a leaf from the cemetery tree had been pressed between tissue pale as a kept promise. On a narrow table at my side rested a packet of cards, the same old tea colour as the names drawer in the town hall. On the top card, 3 names written in the municipal hand: Tally, Morley, Price. Beneath, in a smaller line, my own, not inked, but scored into the card with something blunt, as though the paper had agreed to remember me without the ceremony of black letters. A pencil petal, just a line really, had been sketched in the corner. The journal opened in my hand without my asking. The narrow hand wrote, "When the room signals inward, you are already answered." Then, the hurried script I've come to think of as a friend who means well, "Count nothing down here." I closed the book gently so it would feel respected. The lamp upstairs sent down a thin belt of not quite light through the seam around the panel, and the room accepted that belt the way a person accepts a shawl. At the far end of the trench, a set of 3 bolts threaded through a crosspiece. The ferrule paused there and touched each one with the affection of an archivist. 1, 2, 3. On the brick above them, someone had chalked a small door, a child's rectangle, with the words "Not this door" written beneath it, in letters only a person inside would ever see. I breathed in and out the way one does when a doctor says, "There's nothing to do except rest," and that is doing something. The watch upstairs gave 1 tick through the wood. It sounded like a friend clearing their throat just to remind you they're in the room. I set my palm on the chalk plan and felt the cool travel through my hand to my shoulder, and from there, some useful place in my chest. "I'll stay inside," I said, to the bench, to the trench, to the bolts, to the chalked door, to the ferrule that does not need my voice to know my courtesy. The ferrule answered with that little circle the world keeps offering us, nothing and whole at once. It lifted. The room returned to a state that looked like it had always been. I went back up, 1 step per breath, letting the stair decide how many it wanted to be. At the landing where the circle had been pressed, the ring impression had already faded into floor. At the panel that had pretended not to be a door, the seam recommitted to paint. At the operating level, the levers made their patient inventory. Present, 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 present. The home cap seemed an inch more shell, an inch less mechanism. The lamp held its domestic tone. The watch lay at the margin. The key weighed the journal. The room finished its sentence by letting me go. On my way down the lane, fog toyed with the hedges without committing. The sea entertained the thought of a ripple. The gulls practiced the long loop that means almost. Greyford kept its breath like a lullaby. At home, I set the journal on the folded tourist map, placed the key on the journal, laid the watch on them both, and drew a tiny square on the map where the signal house lives. In the margin I wrote, very small, "Between is a place." Then I drew a hair-thin curve linking the square to Bracken Point, to the exchange, to the river bend, to the pier, to the cemetery tree, to the unnumbered door beneath the town hall. A necklace the town wears only when the room is dim. I said the words the house has come to expect, and that I like saying for their weight. The weather hasn't changed in weeks. It will in the morning. I slept with the sense that something important had been completed in a way that keeps it useful, not by finishing, but by choosing a good place to rest.